Sunny followed the network of underground tunnels to reach the barracks, and then emerged from them near where the rhino was parked, breathing in the cold air. He spent a moment to enjoy the lack of desire to cough. The strange trauma he had received after touching the nightmare gate was all but gone now. He walked forward through the darkness. Snow was crunching under his feet. Weird, is this a good sign or a bad sign? The street illumination in the city often went awry because of the numerous gates outside and within the wall. Usually, the army technicians and civilian personnel would fix and replace the damaged components promptly. But this section was barely lit. No one seemed to have cleaned the snow in a while. Either had the state of the city deteriorated to the point where no one bothered with these things anymore, or was it simply the result of so many people having already been evacuated? By now, only about a third of the initial 200 million remained trapped in Falcon Scott. Maybe the person assigned to maintain this small corner of the city was already safely across the strait, with no one to replace them. Perhaps it was both. Glancing at the dark sky, Sunny rubbed his face and walked toward the rhino. The last few days had been hectic. By all accounts, he should have been dead tired and on the verge of collapsing from sleep deprivation. However, Sunny felt fine. In fact, he felt rather great. His body was full of vigor and vitality, while his mind was fresh and focused. The reason, of course, was the shroud of graceless dusk. He glanced down, studying the transcendent memory. The graceless dusk looked like a simple tunic of fine, soft silk. He had expected it to be white, but to his surprise, the tunic turned out to be of a rich and beautiful black color, with intricate patterns embroidered along its collar, hem, and sleeve edges with silver thread. The hem reached just below his knees, while the sleeves ended at his elbows. The tunic was tied at the waist by an unadorned cord of black silk, and came with a pair of dainty shoes made of the same fabric, with a soft sole that was more suited for a well-tended garden than wilderness. Sunny enjoyed the fact that it allowed him to move around without making the slightest noise. The shoes only looked dainty, too. The black silk that the tunic and the shoes were made of was light and soft, but more durable than tempered steel. Sunny had tested how impervious it was, exactly, and was surprised to find out that the cruel sight couldn't pierce the thin fabric no matter how hard he tried. It didn't burn, get wet, dissolve in acid, or suffer damage from any other elemental attacks he had at his disposal. Only the Sin of Solace managed to cut the black silk, and even then with a lot of trouble. Which wasn't to say that the graceless dusk could serve as a good suit of combat armor. The tunic itself left his forearms, shins, head, and neck exposed, while the soft shoes only covered his feet and ankles. Worse than that, neither were rigid, while the black silk was very hard to pierce. It did nothing to stop blunt attacks and concussive trauma. The marble shell could deal with that, to some extent, but it was still not an ideal situation, however. Sunny didn't really care. The graceless dusk didn't make any noise and was extremely light, not constraining his movements at all. More importantly, the other benefits of the transcendent garment far outweighed its lackluster defense. The 4 blessings were a great boon, as well as the reason why he felt so invigorated despite the recent lack of rest and sleep. The blessing of flesh and the blessing of spirit made him tire much slower, both mentally and physically, while the time he needed to recover from fatigue was drastically cut. In the days after the battle with the devouring cloud, Sunny had only slept for a couple of hours at best, and yet he felt very refreshed and energized. The blessing of soul, meanwhile, boosted the rate at which his essence regenerated. That was an awfully pleasant and valuable benefit, especially here in Antarctica. Finally, there was the blessing of mind. That one was the strangest, but also the most powerful. The enchantment didn't exactly make him smarter or more insightful, but it did make his mind more productive. It was as though there were several compartments within his head now, each capable of running a separate task concurrently, as long as it wasn't too demanding. That made simple calculations and analyzing clear information easier and faster. The effect wasn't new to Sunny, since he had been doing more or less the same thing for a long time, in order to control his shadows. He was long used to perceiving and comprehending the world from several different viewpoints, which all but required him to sort of split his consciousness into several streams. However, after doing some research due to the graceless dusk, he had discovered that most people found such a task to be hard, or even impossible. In any case, His already deviant ability to partition his mind and multitask was boosted even further by the blessing of mind. Needless to say, all of that was extremely useful when applied to weaving, with his mental capacity increased and his essence regenerating at a much faster rate. Sunny had finally been able to crack the case and turn the devil's needle into a memory. He wasn't sure that he would have been able to achieve quite the same result without the boost provided by the 4 blessings. There was the 5th blessing, too. The Blessing of Dusk. This active enchantment was a very insidious one. It allowed Sunny to establish a telepathic connection with another person, or even several, to communicate with them through words and other, more crude means of sharing information such as emotions and vague images. Sadly, he couldn't simply read their minds, since the communications had to be intentional. That said, the recipients of the link were also unable to refuse it, if Sunny wanted. He could bombard them with the most gruesome and loud thoughts, causing something akin to a mental shock. Those with weaker minds were outright stunned, while those with resilience and discipline were at least bound to be disoriented. Of course, the first person Sunny had tried to communicate with telepathically was Saint. To his disappointment, the Blessing of Dusk didn't work on her at all, probably due to the Shadow's immunity to mind attacks. He still didn't know what was going on in that beautiful onyx head of hers. And speaking of Saint, entering the dark interior of the Rhino, Sunny called the taciturn knight forth. She stepped out of his shadow, the plume of her helmet brushing against the vehicle's roof. Suddenly, the massive APC seemed cramped and narrow. Looking up at his loyal devil, Sunny smiled. "Are you hungry? How about a late-night snack?" Sunny's bond with Saint deepens as they prepare for a late-night snack. Share the episode with someone who would love this story. Now, let's return to the shadows. The graceful knight stared at him indifferently, not showing any reaction. The ruby jewels of her eyes glowed with menacing crimson flames, revealing no emotion. Sunny sighed. "Come on, don't you understand what's happening? Just emote, please. It won't kill you, I think." Saint remained silent and as aloof as ever, causing his heart to ache, cursing under his breath. Sunny looked away and summoned the runes. The shimmering symbols appeared in the air in front of him. Name Sunless, true name lost from light. Rank Ascended, Class Devil, Shadow Cores 4-7, Shadow Fragments 2973 4000, Memories, Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud, Midnight Shard, Extraordinary Rock, Prowling Thorn, Endless Spring, Dark Wing, Moonlight Shard, Weaver's Mask, Broken Oath, Autumn Leaf, Cruel Sight, Covetous Coffer, Heavenly Burden, Memory of Fire, Memory of Ice, Strike of Thunder, Morgan's Warbow, Shadow Lantern, Bone Singer, Shadow Chair, Overpriced Saddle, Dying Wish, Sin of Solace, Bitter Cusp, Stifled Scream, Weaver's Needle, Essence Pearl, Nimble Catch, Shroud of Graceless Dusk, Siege Souvenir, Incessant Seeker. His shadow fragments were already closing in on 3,000. That wasn't the important part, though. Sunny studied the list of his memories with a pained expression, then looked down and concentrated on Saint's name. Shadow, Onyx Saint. Shadow fragments, 196,200. He was so close. She was only 3.5 fragments away from saturating the counter. Sadly, there was no time to hunt for memories anymore. There was no time for Saint to slowly recover in his care in case she got wounded, either, which was why he hadn't sent her to defend the wall in the last couple of days. Sunny could have gone and begged for a few memories from people he knew, but there was no need. He had been prepared to fail to reach his goal on time. All it meant was that he had to sacrifice several memories of his own. The problem was that he cherished all of his memories. They were all useful in their own way. Some were integral to his battle prowess. Some were a form of insurance for unexpected situations. The Dark Wing and the Heavenly Burden, for example, were far from stellar memories. However, he needed them in case there was no way to avoid an aerial fight. Other memories possessed useful enchantments that he wanted to replicate one day. Some memories Sunny had outgrown, but was attached to them sentimentally. More than that, he hoped to pass them on to Rain should she become a sleeper. Really, there was only one useless memory in his arsenal, the Silver Bell. However, Sunny was reluctant to sacrifice it. That was the first memory he had ever obtained, and the first memory he had changed with sorcery. It was also a memento that reminded him of happier times. It's just a dormant memory of the second tier. 2. Consuming it won't satiate Saint at all. Nevertheless, he had to sacrifice something. In the end, Sunny sighed bitterly and summoned 3 memories, a heavy kunai, a glistening gem made of polished red coral, and an arrow with green fletching appeared in front of him. The last one was the incessant seeker, an ascended arrow of the 2nd tier he had received recently. It was as powerful as the strike of thunder, but possessed enchantments that guided it toward a single target and enhanced the damage dealt to that sole enemy, which was a real boon. However, Sunny had many other ways to deal high damage to a single target. The 2nd memory was the broken oath. As always, Sunny winced when its soul-eroding aura started slowly dissolving his own soul. It was a great charm that had served him well many times in the past, and synergized perfectly with Saint's immunity to soul attacks. Its power as an awakened memory of the 1st tier wasn't great, though. With the caliber of enemies Sunny was facing these days, it was like a drop in the ocean. Aside from that, Saint was mostly fighting alongside Nightmare now, and would hopefully be surrounded by more shadows in the future. The others didn't possess the same immunity, which limited the usefulness of the red gem. The 1st memory Sunny summoned was the Prowling Thorn. He sighed again, looking at the kunai with regret. There was nothing wrong with the throwing dagger, and they had gone through a lot together. But it had outlived its usefulness. Sunny would have preferred to keep the Prowling Thorn simply for utility, but the situation demanded he let go of something. Sunny had already lost the Patient Avenger, and now he was going to lose 3 more perfectly fine memories. He felt as if his heart was bleeding. Waste, such a waste. He closed his eyes and then handed the dagger, the gem, and the arrow to Saint without looking. Here, you eat these, enjoy your meal. The graceful Onyx Knight silently took the memories and crushed them in her fists without pausing even for a moment. Hearing the dreadful sound, Sunny was stunned. She didn't even hesitate. Those were very precious, damn it. Opening his eyes, he saw 4 streams of radiant sparks being absorbed into the shadow's body. Then, her eyes flashed with dark glee. The runes still hung in the air, the counter showing. Shadow fragments, 200. In the next moment, the shadow that existed where Saint's soul should have been suddenly rippled. The 4 dark embers in its depths shone with lightless radiance, and wisps of black flames rose from her armor. Sunny took a step back, mesmerized by the familiar scene. He had already seen it once, back when his taciturn knight ascended. In the next moment, Saint's figure was enveloped entirely by the black flames, making it impossible to see her. A powerful gust of wind blew through the interior of the rhino, both unbearable heat and chilling coldness assaulting Sunny at the same time. He blinked. Crap, maybe I should have done this in the Soul Sea. But there was nothing he could do now but wait, nervous for his expensive APC. Sunny summoned a barrier of shadows to surround Saint. A minute passed in tense silence, then 2. Then something exploded within the barrier, shattering it easily and sending Sunny flying back. A wave of darkness rolled through the rhino, turning its interior into a mess and cracking its armored windows from within. The enormous vehicle shook and trembled, then grew still with a loud groan. Sunny scrambled back to his feet and stared at Saint, who was standing in the same spot, seemingly unchanged. However, the darkness dwelling within her was now much deeper and more frightening. Her onyx body was radiating a sense of vast, dreadful power, and the menacing crimson flames dancing in her ruby eyes were brighter. His shadow, now a transcendent devil, tilted her head slightly, looking at him with her usual indifference, but Sunny could feel a hint of emotion hidden behind it: pride, satisfaction, gratitude. Slowly, a wide grin appeared on his face. Sunny brushed the graceless dusk, straightened, and looked at the menacing devil with a smile. Should I start calling you Saint now, huh? His shadow was a transcendent now. Sunny found it hard to believe, even though he had been the one who made her transcendence possible. It was just that saints held a special place in human culture. They were the epitome of vast and unobtainable power. They were more demigods than people, enigmatic and awe-inspiring, so distant as to almost be ineffable. He was now a master himself, and on top of that, one of the strongest there was, but even still. A huge gap separated Sunny from someone like Sky Tide or Bloodwave, which he didn't dare test. To think that a similar existence now served him. It was hard to comprehend. Saint's transcendence, without a doubt, marked a new chapter in Sunny's rise to power, of course. It was unclear where the Onyx Knight was truly equal to the mighty saints of the human race. In terms of purely physical prowess, she was at least on par with them, and most likely far superior. Her skill was outstanding, as was her talent and willpower. After all, Saint had always been outstanding. She often triumphed over adversaries that were much more powerful than her, but so were human transcendents. There was no such thing as an average saint. Each and every one of them were the absolute best of the human race, battle-hardened warriors of utmost talent, resolve, and ability, with thousands upon thousands of bloody fights under their belt. There was also one fundamental difference between humans and creatures such as his shadow. Humans possessed aspects, while creatures didn't. Saint had just gained her powers, wielding elemental darkness to strengthen her body and her weapons. However, every human transcendent wielded a powerful aspect and was armed with several potent abilities, including the transformation. They were also all carriers of the nightmare spell. Simply put, Sunny didn't know who would end up victorious if Saint fought a human transcendent. He had a feeling that, by herself, the Onyx Knight would lose. However, if she was augmented by his shadows, the result might be very different. Luckily, he had no intention of combating Saints anytime soon. Dismissing the shadow, Sunny sighed and spent some time cleaning up the mess her transcendence had made of the interior of the Rhino. The APC was in a sorry state, but still functional. See, the day is only getting better and better. Or was it night? Here in Antarctica, it was always night, so sticking to the old notion of time was getting harder and harder. He made himself a late supper or an early breakfast and settled in the lounge area for a few minutes. After a while, his communicator made a familiar sound. It seemed that the siege capital's communication array had activated, as it usually did twice a day, sending packets of data to those with a bandwidth quota. Sunny looked at the new message with some relief. Rain was doing fine, it seemed. Her response was shorter than usual, but she was obviously not experiencing any symptoms of being infected by the spell. He had always been worried about his sister, and after observing so many mundanes being killed by the first nightmare here in Antarctica, and having killed many monstrous abominations their bodies had turned into, that worry only grew stronger. Sunny sighed. She's okay. She's safe. There's no reason for her to contract the spell to begin with, and even if she does, Serpent is with her. Sunny missed his serpentine shadow. It would have been tremendously useful during the Southern Quadrant campaign, considering how dire his need for essence had been from day one in this cold hell, not to mention the versatile and powerful nature of Serpent's abilities. And yet, Sunny hadn't regretted leaving it with Rain even once. Her safety took precedence, and he had many other ways to protect himself, if anything. Experiencing the bitter hardships of the Antarctica campaign without the Serpent had given him an opportunity to learn how to manage his essence with utmost efficiency, as well as vastly improve his control over it. Thinking of his shadows, Sunny suddenly felt curious about their relationship to his class. Even though the Soul Serpent was currently away, each of the shadows occupied one of his cores. Did it mean that he would only ever be able to control 7 of them, at most? If that were the case, maybe the dismal rate at which he received echoes wasn't such a terrible thing. He might have been very upset if someone like Kurt, the awakened psychopath he had killed in the waking world, prevented him from turning Nightmare into one of his shadows. That time, his dislike of the man and of the idea of owning human echoes had prevented Sunny from wasting fragments on the transformation. But he would have caved in if given a better opportunity. Or, wait. Would he have even been able to make Kurt into a shadow without losing Saint or Serpent? He was just an awakened monster back then, possessing only 2 shadow cores, and realized he was just rambling. Sunny remained motionless for a few moments, staring into the distance. He was thinking about unnecessary things to distract himself from what was about to come. Goliath was approaching, the creature that had almost killed him once. The Fallen Titan had already destroyed one siege capital, so there was a real chance that Falcon Scott would be destroyed by the abominable giant. As well, Sunny and Jet were determined to slay the gargantuan creature of stone, but anything could happen, even if their preparations worked. There was no telling what damage would be done to the city wall before the Titan perished. If he perished, This day might turn out to be the last day for many. Many people, maybe even Sonny himself. He closed his eyes for a moment. Over my dead body, well, obviously, that's kind of a given. With that, Sonny forced a pale smile onto his face and picked up his communicator. His response to Rain didn't contain any of the grave worries that gnawed at him, even though she was smart enough to read between the lines. Sonny made an effort to hide the ugly truth as well as he could. That was for his benefit, too, while writing messages to Rain. Sonny was almost able to believe in his own lies. Not knowing the truth was a solace. Some time later, the members of his cohort approached the Rhino. Belle, Dorn, Samara, Kimmy, Luster. Walking inside, they froze for a moment, studying the upturned interior of the APC and the cracks in its armored windows with stunned expressions. After a while, Luster cleared his throat and asked him what had happened. Sonny gave him a deadpan look. "I had a lady over, she transcended." The young man laughed nervously and called it a good one. "Sir." After that, he practically ran to the pilot's cabin to check on the internal systems of the Rhino. As Luster went through the diagnostics, he kept mumbling under his breath. "Gods, did he crash it into a Titan? This damage, my poor baby."
Prepare yourselves. Army Command is certain that Goliath will reach the city either today or tomorrow. In any case, we won't be leaving the wall until he does. This is going to be the big one, guys.
His soldiers grew somber, their eyes full of calm determination. Sonny nodded. "Don't worry about the Titan himself. Colonel Jet and I will take care of the big bastard. However, Goliath isn't going to show up alone, and judging by how Erebus Field fell, there's a big chance that the wall will be breached. I don't need to tell you how important it's to prevent the nightmare creatures from getting inside. However, if the situation becomes hopeless, be ready to retreat to the secondary line of defense within the city."
He paused for a moment, looking at them with a serious expression. "Don't be stupid and die an unnecessary death. I need you alive to fight tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and the day after that. Dying might as well be considered desertion at this point. No one is allowed to die without my permission. Understood?"
The members of his cohort grinned, then saluted and answered, "Yes, sir." "I am scared of you way more than I am scared of death, sir. I wouldn't dare." Sonny blinked a couple of times at that last one, then nodded as they added that they wouldn't think of it. "That's great, let's go then." Soon the Rhino started and moved forward with some effort. They drove across Falcon Scott, where a lot of streets were now empty, and a lot were unlit, snow piled high in some areas, and in others, crowds of refugees were anxiously hurrying through the cold. Luster was stubbornly sticking to only the well-illuminated roads. For some reason, which made the progress a bit slow, the wall steadily grew closer and closer, before they reached the secondary defense ring. However, Sonny suddenly ordered him to stop the APC. The young man looked back with a silent question. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then said, "Wait for me here, I won't be long." With that, he left the Rhino and walked toward a familiar dormitory tower, which happened to be nearby. No one was cleaning the snow in front of its entrance. This time, Sonny stood there for a minute or two, staring at the flimsy doors with a grim expression. Eventually, he sighed. "Even if the whole city is destroyed, this damned dormitory must remain standing. I'll make sure of it." With that, he turned around and started walking away. When he did, however, he almost stumbled into someone approaching the dormitory. "Watch where you are going, iddy, huh, Sonny." He sighed and looked up, noticing Bate and Professor Obel. They must have been returning from their own shifts, Bate at the volunteer center, the old man at the engineering wing of the government complex. The young woman blinked a couple of times, staring at him with surprise. Before Sonny could come up with something to say, she asked, "Aren't you cold?"
"I am not actually. Elemental resistance, you know."
You are still a human, are you not? Put something warm on for spell's sake. I imagine fighting on the wall with a running nose isn't a great idea. Ascended snot is still snot.
"I am still a human, that's true, thanks. I'll try to remember that."
"Were you on your way to visit us, Major Sunless? Come, there's no point in standing here in the cold."
No, I was actually on my way to start the shift on the wall. Army Command is expecting a big fight, so it's all hands on deck. Well, even more so than usual, in any case. Make sure to remain inside and be careful in the next day or so. Things might get a little hectic.
I see. Well, we won't keep you then. Please stay safe.
He moved forward, but then paused and patted Sunny on the shoulder. Maybe y'all stop by after your shift, then? It's nothing much, but Bait received a bit of extra rations today. We are planning to cook up a feast for everyone who's still waiting for a ticket in our block. I will save you a portion. Sunny remained silent for one moment too long, then shrugged. When asked why not, he said it was a promise. He watched Professor Obel and Bait disappear inside, then slowly turned around and walked back toward the rhino. As he walked, the smile disappeared from his face, replaced by a dark, ruthless expression. It was time to kill a titan. Deep shadows nestled in his eyes. What happened at Erebus Field couldn't be allowed to repeat itself. Goliath had to die. And Sunny was just the person to kill him. An eye for an eye, a death for a death. Sunny was a very petty and vindictive person, and the two of them, they had a score to settle. The winds were howling as they crashed into the colossal bulwark of the city wall. The soldiers of the First Army were shivering on the battlements, staring into the hazy mist of the blizzard with grim expressions. These were the lucky ones. The less fortunate were far below, on the ground, ready to defend the breaches with their lives, because of the ugly rifts in the defensive barrier of the city. The logistics of the siege had become much harder. Today, it was especially so. Since no one knew the direction from which the Titan was going to attack, Goliath could come from the south, marching across the ravaged landscape and shaking the earth with his every step. He could come from the north, emerging from below the dark waves to attack the port fortress first. For all Army Command knew, he could even crawl from under the ground. The scope of the Titan's abilities was still a mystery. That was why the defenders were dispersed along the whole perimeter of the wall instead of congregating at one or several of its sections. However, Sunny and Jet, as well as their two cohorts of irregulars, had found themselves in a familiar spot, right above the main entrance of the siege capital, not too far away from the nightmare gate that had torn through the wall not too long ago. Sunny was sitting with his back against the alloy parapet, meditating. Soul Reaper was standing nearby. Looking across the vast killing field, the landscape obscured by the veil of snow, both were trying to ignore the whispers of the call. It was more than a bit annoying. To have to deal with it on top of the sickening anxiety of waiting for the start of the battle. Sunny sighed, then looked up at Master Jet. His hair was getting in the way, so he brushed it aside before he could speak. She suddenly asked why he didn't cut it.
The thing is, mundane scissors and auto barbers stopped working on me. I should probably just use a sharp memory and cut it myself. Yeah, that's what I'll do one of these days.
I know a guy back in Northern Quadrant Siege Capital. He's very in demand. As one of the few awakened hairstylists around, there are many saints among his clientele. But if you want, I can get you a recommendation.
Sure, when we're back in Northern Quadrant Siege Capital.
He remained silent for a few moments, then asked, "How sure are you that we'll be able to destroy Goliath?"
As long as you pull off your part of the plan, pretty sure Bloodwave will step in if something goes wrong, too. It's a shame that Sky Tide is away fighting the winter beast again, but we should be all right without her.
Sunny nodded and said he thought so. However, Jet interrupted him by raising a hand. He grew quiet and raised an eyebrow. She looked into the darkness with a calm expression. "Listen." Sunny did so, hearing nothing but the wind and the stifled breaths of the thousands of soldiers surrounding them. Then, a muffled sound reached his ears from somewhere far away. A deep, resonant boom rolled across the land, and then, after a long and arduous pause, again, another boom echoed in the distance. Sunny stood up, staring into the blizzard. Suddenly, he felt a chill creeping up his spine as he said that he was coming from a vast distance. The thunderous steps of the colossal giant were rolling over the world, even though the soldiers couldn't see anything because of the raging snowstorm. The sound alone made them pale and grasped their weapons with trembling hands. The heavy steps continued, a rhythmic pounding that grew steadily louder. Each one assaulted them, almost like a mental attack. Jet tried to contact Army Command, then cursed when the interference made it impossible. Calling out one of the messengers, she said tersely, Inform the HQ that Goliath is approaching from the south. We need reinforcements here as soon as possible. Go." The pale-faced messenger saluted and disappeared from view, and then there was nothing for them to do but wait by Sunny's side. The members of his cohort were preparing for battle. Everyone around was doing the same, and from the impenetrable white haze beyond the wall, the steps of the giant continued to boom, slowly growing louder and closer and much more frightening. A thunderous boom shook the air, and then, after a torturous span of silence, again, another boom rolled across the killing field. Sunny gritted his teeth, and on the battlement behind him, 4 shadows shivered, hidden in the blizzard. Goliath was slowly approaching Falcon Scott. No one could see him, but the heavy steps of the Titan sounded like foreboding war drums. Soon, the ground started shaking with each of them. The tremors traveled through the alloy structure of the city wall, making it vibrate. Sunny felt his body growing stiff, as if paralyzed by the memory of being crushed and broken by the giant's foot. Humans couldn't really recall pain, but remembering the feeling of being hurt was very easy, especially if one was hurt terribly. He had almost died that day. He should have died, if not for a couple of memories and a bit of luck. His body remembered being destroyed. Snarling, Sunny shook off the paralyzing fear and peered into the blizzard, hoping to see the hateful shape of the walking mountain. Instead, he just heard another distant boom, another distant boom echoed, and a voice breathed a curse of damnation. Another heavy boom shook the ground, another boom echoed. Suddenly, the thunderous steps stopped. A moment later, a rift appeared in the wall of the blizzard, and for a few moments, he could see far and wide. Sunny's eyes narrowed. Out there at the edge of the killing field, a giant creature stood in front of the mountains, taller than the city wall by far. The Titan looked like a mountain himself. His vaguely humanoid body was broad and misshapen, made of uneven, weathered stone. He had 3 mighty arms and 1 enormous eye that stared at the soldiers of the First Army with an alien, cold, terrifying malice. The milky eye was completely white, having no iris and no pupil. Behind and around the Titan, a vast and dark sea of bodies was undulating as it flowed down from the slopes of the mountains. Nightmare creatures, a stunningly large horde of them, were following the fallen Titan. For a moment, the world seemed frozen. In that dreadful instant, Sunny forced himself to smile. All of it, him coming to Antarctica, marching with the First Army across its cold expanse, surviving Low 49, clawing his way back north with a train of refugees. The long weeks of fighting at Falcon Scott had been for this moment. He looked at Goliath with murderous intensity. "Come here, bastard." In the next moment, as if answering his call, the giant stepped forward. As soon as Goliath took a step forward, and the wall vibrated under Sunny once again, he called upon Saint by his side. Master Jet mounted the parapet of the battlement, clinging to it with one hand and ready to push herself away. In her other hand, the slender glaive weaved itself from snowflakes. The sea of nightmare creatures flowed forward, overtaking the marching colossus. The familiar thunder of discharging railguns tore the snowstorm apart, and the turrets joined them a moment later, drowning the world in a roaring cacophony. A tall and graceful figure clad in onyx armor stepped onto the wall from the shadows. Instantly, her fearsome presence permeated the air, making soldiers turn around and crane their necks, staring at the menacing Black Knight in fright. Saint's ruby eyes flashed with cold, crimson flames. Someone yelled that it was Mongrel. "Mongrel is here. Thank the gods." Their calls rolled across the wall, and the soldiers that had been shaken by the terrible visage of the marching Titan regained some of their confidence, even though Saint was dwarfed by the looming shapes of bulky MWPs. At that moment, she seemed much greater than the towering machines. "Show that ugly boulder who's in charge, Mongrel." As for Sunny, no one paid him much attention. Whatever fame he had earned among the fighters of the First Army paled in comparison to his flamboyant alter ego. After all, unlike him, Mongrel was a mysterious character. People were free to fill in the blanks using nothing but their imaginations, and the things they came up with were always much more fantastical than the truth. Well, at least the version of the truth about Sunny that he shared with the world. The actual truth was so outlandish that no one would probably believe it. Sunny muttered that it didn't matter. Watching Goliath walk forward, Sunny summoned a very special memory, the one he had worked so hard to create. his payback gift to the stone giant, the Siege Souvenir. Suddenly, a very lengthy and sharp javelin appeared in Saint's hand. It was about 3 meters long, incredibly heavy, and entirely white, a sense of immense, wild, destructive power radiated from the white javelin, making even Sunny himself feel slightly uncomfortable. Of course, the javelin was the quill of the corrupted devil he had collected from an army warehouse a long time ago, the thing Sunny had spent most of his free time in Falcon Scott trying to enchant. The Siege Souvenir was now a transcendent memory, and a very special one at that. Several transcendent soul shards, as well as rivers of essence that formed numerous shadow strings, had gone into its creation. The difficulty Sunny had met was merely one of scope. Of all the enchantments he had learned and recreated before, that one was the vastest and most difficult. However, there was no alternative. The long javelin possessed only 2 enchantments. The first one was Death Dealer, which Sunny had copied from Morgan's warbow. Bestowing that one on the Devil's Needle had been hard, but also somewhat straightforward. The difficulty Sunny had met was merely one of scope. Of all the enchantments he had learned and recreated before, that one was the vastest and most difficult. However, there was no alternative. Death Dealer was the most destructive single-target enchantment in his arsenal, and so nothing else would have done. It was also extremely, dreadfully gluttonous in its consumption of essence, but not gluttonous enough as far as Sunny was concerned. That was where the second enchantment he had bestowed on the Siege Souvenir came in. That one had no name, because it was invented by him. Creating it wasn't technically hard, but required Sunny to teach himself an entirely new facet of weaving, as well as accomplish something he had never done before, not simply copy, but disassemble and heavily modify an existing enchantment. The enchantment that had served as the basis was the Unbroken of the Midnight Shard. It allowed the wielder access to a vast reservoir of power when at death's doorstep. As long as the wielder refused to surrender and kept fighting against overwhelming odds, Sunny wasn't interested in augmenting the javelin with additional power, nor was he interested in creating a limitation tied to how close someone was to death or their character. What he was interested in was the reservoir itself. After all, Death Dealer had to be powered by something, and so Sunny had spent many arduous hours studying the weave of the Unbroken, trying to understand how it worked. What element of the tapestry of ethereal strings was responsible for which part of it, and how to isolate the effect he wanted to achieve, how to create a reservoir of power that could feed the Siege Souvenir from the inside. In the end, with the timely help of the graceless Dusk, he had succeeded in both of his undertakings. The white javelin was much longer and heavier than an arrow. In fact, calling it a javelin was somewhat misleading, since it was more akin to a projectile worthy of a siege engine. Nevertheless, it possessed the capacity to deliver the same devastating force as an arrow sent flying with the help of the Death Dealer, only at a much greater scale. A lot of power was needed to achieve that effect. Much more power than anyone in Falcon Scott could have supplied in one go. That was why Sunny had enchanted the Siege Souvenir to possess an independent reservoir of essence, and siphoned a sea of it into the javelin over the days. He had basically created an entirely new type of memory. Weak memories usually possessed passive enchantments that were powered by the ambient essence used to manifest the memory. Powerful memories usually possessed active enchantments that required the wielder to manipulate and spend their own essence in order to use them. The Siege Souvenir, meanwhile, possessed a dire enchantment that fed directly on the javelin's own essence. The result of his hard work was a tremendously powerful memory. It was so powerful, in fact, that only refined material harvested from a corrupted creature could withstand the dreadful enchantments. Anything less would have disintegrated under strain. Even then, the Siege Souvenir was bound to be a one-use memory. The quill of the corrupted devil wasn't going to survive the release of its own destructive power. There was one last hurdle to overcome to make use of it, though not just anyone could wield it. Even Sunny himself wasn't strong enough to make use of his creation in the intended way. That was why he had needed Saint to evolve. He needed a transcendent being to bring forth the Siege Souvenir's potential. And now, he had one. Goliath walked forward, the world quaking under the weight of his steps. The sea of nightmare creatures was flowing past his titanic feet, and all around them the furious blizzard was slowly retreating. the winds dying down as pale starlight washed over the vast killing field on the tall, broken wall of the city. Thousands of turrets were roaring as they sent rivers of bullets into the attacking horde. The moonless night was torn apart by the glow of overheated barrels, the shine of swift tracer rounds, and the flashes of railgun rounds striking their targets in a conflagration of force, heat, and blinding light. A few of those heavy tungsten rounds had hit Goliath, only to disintegrate fruitlessly without leaving even a scratch on the stone hide of the menacing Titan. The soldiers of the First Army trembled as they joined the barrage, the mundane soldiers, the awakened, the towering war platforms. The few masters that were still alive after 2 weeks of the dreadful siege, on the ground near the breached sections of the wall. Others were shivering as they craned their necks to stare at the approaching Titan. However, Sonny remained still, whispering for it to get closer. He was perhaps the only human in Falcon Scott who wanted the colossal giant to walk faster. The Siege Souvenir could only be used once, so he had only one shot to shatter Goliath's stone carapace. Standing indifferently by his side, Saint raised the long javelin and placed it on her shoulder. The four shadows moved, fusing with her onyx armor. It shone with black radiance, and the feeling of great power emanating from the graceful figure of the taciturn stone knight instantly became much vaster, much deeper, and much more terrifying. At the same time, darkness flowed from Saint's gauntlet, slowly spreading across the length of the white javelin. Its whiteness was consumed, replaced by a lightless blackness, while the Transcendent Devil herself was augmented by the shadows. Her weapon was now enhanced by the blade of darkness. There was the mantle of darkness, as well, which made Saint stronger when surrounded by darkness and shadows. Sonny summoned the shadow lantern, allowing it to consume all surrounding light. Soon, the three of them, Sonny, Saint, and Jet, were hidden from sight within a circle of deep shadow. Sonny murmured that they were almost there. The fastest of the nightmare creatures, those that had survived the barrage, meaning the strongest and most vile of them, were already moments away from reaching the wall, separating into 4 wide rivers of flesh to attack the 4 breaches. Goliath, meanwhile, was a few steps away from crossing half of the killing field. Sonny looked directly at the hateful giant and prepared to give Saint the command. At that moment, however, something changed. The Titan's massive, malformed head turned slightly, and his sole eye stared back. Sonny shivered. There were thousands and thousands of humans on the wall, and all of them must have looked like mere ants to Goliath. However, somehow, it felt as though the Titan was gazing directly at him. The weight of that gaze was almost physical. No, it was much more dire than that. Sonny gritted his teeth, feeling a very bad premonition grasp his heart, and wondered what. Then the milky surface of the giant's eye quivered and slid away like an eyelid. Behind it, a second eye was revealed. Unlike the first one, which was white and had neither an iris nor a pupil, that one was of a furious red color, as if made of pure magma, and had 3 incandescent pupils floating in its depths, like windows into a scorching inferno. Suddenly, Sonny was enveloped by unbearable heat. He felt water streaming down on him, and looked up to see the snow clouds melting in the skies above. Bizarrely, it was raining in the middle of the polar winter. Beneath him, the 70-meter tall defensive wall of the city suddenly moved and groaned. Glancing over the parapet, Sonny saw with horror that the impregnable alloy, it was melting, too, all around him. The mighty MWPs were collapsing into puddles of liquid metal, the pilots screaming as they burned alive. Barrels of the powerful turrets disappeared into streams of incandescent drops, and the mighty railguns grew silent, a few meters away. Samara screamed and flinched back from her rifle, a vicious burn marring her cheek. Across the entire southern section of the city wall, the great defensive barrier bent and deformed. Moments away from collapsing entirely, countless people plummeted to their deaths or were consumed by the immolating heat. All of it happened in an instant. Someone breathed. Gods! Knowing that there was no time to waste, Sonny shuddered as he changed his command slightly and sent it to Saint. The Onyx Knight instantly moved, taking a single step. She raised the javelin behind her. For a moment, Saint's entire body turned into a graceful arch, from the tip of her foot to her hip, to her shoulder, to her fist. Then, her hand whipped forward, and the battlement under her shattered from immense pressure. Even her vambrace cracked. shards of onyx falling down like precious gems. At the last moment, the four shadows slid from her fingers and wrapped themselves around the Siege Souvenir. The long, immeasurably heavy javelin shot forward with the speed of lightning. Immediately, there was a deafening boom of the sound barrier being pierced, and a powerful shockwave rolled across the battlement, throwing people off their feet. The artificial memory streaked across the black sky like a line of pure darkness, creating a whirlpool of hurricane winds in its wake. A split second later, it hit Goliath right in the eye. There was a flash of light, and then a world-shaking thunderclap, and then the sound of shattering stone. The Siege Souvenir plunged right between the Titan's three pupils, disappearing into the red molten eye entirely. Then, it burst from the back of the giant's head in an explosion of broken stone. Your memory has been destroyed, as Sunny watched in stunned silence. Vast cracks snaked through Goliath's head. The colossus froze in a strange pose, its torso leaning slightly back. His eye was completely destroyed, and his head shattered and fell apart. Giant slabs of stone plummeting down from a great height. The walking mountain swayed, twitched, and then slowly started to tilt. Everyone, both the humans and the nightmare creatures, froze, watching the Titan fall in utter shock. Sunny blinked and asked what had just happened, as if responding. The spell whispered softly into his ear. "You've slain a fallen Titan, minor shard of the stone Titan. Your shadow grows stronger." The colossal, headless body of Goliath tilted forward, and then started to fall because of its enormous size. It seemed as though the giant's corpse slowly floated through the air instead of crashing down in an obliterating avalanche of stone. However, hundreds of nightmare creatures below were already panicking as they tried to flee and escape being crushed to death. Sunny froze, momentarily stunned, and asked again what had just happened. He had killed the damned bastard. How? That wasn't what was supposed to happen. Sunny had poured countless hours into creating the Siege Souvenir and making sure that Saint would transcend in time. However, he had never expected to slay the fallen Titan with one strike. A Titan was a Titan. They weren't supposed to die so easily. The plan was for the javelin to shatter the stone carapace on the chest of the giant, creating a path toward his heart. Master Jet was supposed to enter the breach and destroy Goliath's soul cores from within, while Sunny and Saint would attack from the outside. Together, they were meant to slowly bring the giant down, and maybe even survive the process. When the Titan had revealed his incandescent eye and started melting the city wall, Sunny was forced to switch targets and command Saint to aim for the eye instead. He had never thought that Goliath would be killed by that single strike. Was that eye the Titan's Achilles heel? Kim hadn't noticed a pronounced vulnerability after they encountered the giant on the coastal highway, though maybe her powers weren't enough to see it. Or was the vulnerability only exposed when Goliath revealed his inner, hidden eye? In any case, the Titan was undoubtedly dead. Sunny had killed him for a moment. A dark glee ignited in his heart. That's for Erebus Field, you foul bastard. And for me, too, that's payback for almost killing me. But then his glee disappeared, by all accounts. Sunny should have felt exhilarated. He had killed a Titan after all. But instead of joy, he felt chills running down his spine. Suddenly tense, Sunny looked around. The armaments of the defensive barrier were all but destroyed, and the wall itself was damaged and deformed. A few sections had collapsed entirely, but most still stood. The defenders had suffered heavy losses, especially among the pilots burned to death with their MWPs. Many soldiers had lost their rifles, and the outer layers of their powered armor suits were severely damaged. However, there were still enough of them alive to continue the fight. Maybe, luckily, most Awakened had managed to dismiss their steel memories, saving them from being destroyed, and were now summoning them back. Everyone was still in utter shock, mesmerized by the sight of the slowly toppling colossus. Something was wrong. Though very, very wrong. Goliath shouldn't have died that easily or that fast. Master Jet, who had been hanging outside the wall, ready to push herself forward to follow the plan and attack the Titan, climbed back and looked at him, a rare expression of bewilderment written on her face, and asked Sunny what the hell and how. He didn't answer, staring past her at the falling mountain. He said quietly that he had killed him. He did, even before the body fell. Wide cracks appeared all across it. Chunks of stone were splintering off and falling down. From the distance, it almost looked as if the giant had been diseased, his skin covered by sores and ulcers, and the cracks behind some of them, instead of solid stone, there was nothing but darkness, as if parts of the Titan's body had been hollowed out long before the battle, moments before the massive corpse crashed into the ground. Sonny's eyes widened and he cursed. In the next second, the colossal mass of stone collided against the earth, making the whole world shake. Enormous clouds of snow, dirt, and debris rose into the air, and countless nightmare creatures were crushed under the obliterating weight. A thunderous roar rolled over the killing field, and shards of stone shot outward like bullets, decimating even more abominations. One more section of the wall collapsed. However, that wasn't what Sonny was looking at. His gaze was locked on the massive corpse itself. When Goliath's body hit the ground, large portions of it cracked like the shell of a rotten egg, and from within, a tide of darkness flowed, eviscerating the few wounded nightmare creatures that still clung to life and stretching toward the broken city wall like black tentacles. Sonny breathed, the heart of darkness. The river of black beetles had mysteriously disappeared some days ago, and almost at the same time, Goliath's speed had decreased. The beetles liked to tunnel through mountains and devour mighty creatures from within. The fallen Titan had been like a walking mountain himself, and mighty beyond belief as well. Someone should have guessed that the giant might have been parasitized by the legion of the tiny, dreadful creatures, but no one had. It was so clear, in hindsight. Sonny himself had been too blinded by the threat of the Titan to consider such a possibility. His preconceived notions of what constituted power, and his personal animosity against the stone giant, resulted in a ruinous case of tunnel vision. He cursed. He glanced at the city defenses once again, realizing that almost everything that could have been used against vast swarms of tiny vermin had been destroyed by Goliath. The first army had been prepared to face one overwhelming enemy, not myriads of dangerous, but comparatively weak creatures. He looked at Jet, his lips trembling, and said, "Bloodwave." She frowned and asked, "What?" Sonny grabbed the Soul Reaper by the shoulders and barked, "Bloodwave, summon Bloodwave here. He's our best hope of stopping the Heart of Darkness." She hesitated for a short moment, then looked beyond the wall and hissed an explicit curse. Then, Jet took a step back and started summoning a memory that was supposed to give the fearsome saint a signal to abandon his duty of protecting the ships and join the battle. Sonny, meanwhile, was already moving, calling upon a few memories of his own. He had no idea how they would be able to handle both the vast horde of nightmare creatures that had come with Goliath and the tide of black beetles with the defensive barrier ruined and barely holding. The wall was severely damaged, and many of the soldiers had either died or were rendered helpless, their weapons destroyed, and yet they had no other choice but to fight and claw the victory out of fate's grasp somehow. There was simply nowhere to retreat.
This is bad, this is really bad. That was an understatement. Currently, Falcon Scott was facing two threats. The first one was the uncountable horde of nightmare creatures that had followed Goliath, and was now flowing across the killing field like a dark tide. Some of them had already reached the deformed barrier and engaged the defenders of the breaches in a furious melee. Some infiltrated the city through the new fissures in the melted wall and were now rampaging in the staging area. With the turrets destroyed and the mighty railguns heavily damaged, there was no way to slow down the advance of the horde. Even the MWPs were destroyed, and most of the soldiers had either lost their weapons or were seriously injured. The only ones who remained relatively unscathed were the awakened. There were around 700 of them on the southern section of the wall, and most were still able to fight. There were reinforcements coming from the other three sections of the wall. But it was going to take some time for them to arrive, time that they didn't have. The second threat was the Heart of Darkness. 4 rivers of dark beetles were flowing toward the ravaged wall, reaching for it like giant black claws. Each individual beetle was capable of biting through powerful armor-type memories, metal and flesh. Their only redeeming quality was that the tiny vermin weren't too hard to crush, which was why Army Command had planned to rely heavily on the powerful defensive armaments in case the Dark Swarm showed up. With those armaments mostly destroyed, the danger posed by the Heart of Darkness had risen tremendously. There were several ascended with aspects suitable to face such an enemy as well, but some of them had died in the past 2 weeks, while others weren't on the southern section of the wall, since no one had expected the Heart of Darkness to attack that day. Sunny gritted his teeth and cursed.
Gritting his teeth, Sunny looked at Jet and asked what they should do.
At that time, a familiar flaming arrow, albeit much weaker than it had been during the battle against the devouring cloud, flew into the mass of beetles from somewhere much further down the wall. Winter was still alive, at least. Master Jet let out an angry hiss. There's no choice but to retreat to the secondary defense perimeter and enact the following protocol. However, even that's impossible right now, if we don't want to lose the city. We need to push the horde back and give the men enough time to run. We also need to obliterate the damned bugs. Push back the horde. Sunny suddenly felt cold. There were so many holes in the city wall now that it was basically useless. That meant that the only way to stall the abominations was to sortie out and face the nightmare creatures on the killing field. Blade against claw, needless to say, that was nearly a suicide mission. Even if the defenders of Falcon Scott succeeded, their losses would be staggering. There was another option, of course. The Awakened could abandon the mundane soldiers and run, logically speaking. Leaving mundanes to die and preserving the arguably more valuable asset was a valid strategy. War wasn't a purely logical affair, though the most reasonable strategy wasn't always the best strategy. Things like spirit, morale, and mutual trust had much greater weight than Sunny had once thought. Any army without these intangible qualities would be doomed. As a colonel and an ascended, Master Jet was the senior officer on the southern section of the wall and the person in charge. The decision was hers, and Sunny didn't envy her position one bit. She lingered for a few moments, then took a deep breath and shouted, her voice spreading far and wide due to the effects of a special memory. "This is Soul Reaper Jet. All Awakened, assemble in cohorts and prepare to sortie. We must push the enemy back. All mundane personnel abandon the wall. I repeat, abandon the wall. I am ordering a full retreat to the secondary defense line." As soon as the echo of her voice disappeared into the cold night, Jet stepped toward a messenger that had lost his footing during the Titan's attack, grabbed the man by the collar, and pulled him to his feet with one powerful motion. The slightly disoriented soldier stared at her with a pale face. She looked at him somberly for a moment, and then said quietly, "Inform Army Command to prepare the Rampart Protocol and be ready to activate it as soon as I give the command. If I die, they should act at their discretion." The frightened man nodded and disappeared, using his aspect ability to run at incredible speed. With that done, Jet glanced at Sunny. She remained silent for a moment, then smiled darkly and asked if he was ready.
Not even a little bit.
Well, tough. While the Awakened are fighting off the nightmare creatures, someone has to deal with the bugs. They absolutely can't be allowed to enter the city. I'll stop the left. Swarm, send that awesome echo of yours to face the middle left one, and go to the middle right yourself. Bloodwave will handle the last one, with some luck. The Ascended who were supposed to deal with them in the first place will arrive to reinforce us before everyone dies. The couple of them who are still alive.
Sunny looked at her with a dubious expression. How am I supposed to fight against countless thousands of tiny bugs? Master Jet sighed. You are resourceful, figure something out. And if you do, let me know. I am asking myself the same question. With that, she turned away to give orders to her cohort. Sunny did the same.
Beldorn, Samara, Luster, and Kim were looking at him, their eyes uncertain. He forced out a smile. "You all heard the boss. We are going to sortie with the rest, then push forward and block one of the beetles' swarms. I'll take point. Samara, you lost your rifle, so just blast any that get past me with essence. Y'all be our secondary slayer. Luster, support Sam, Beldorn, and Kimmy. You guys will protect Luster and Samara. Don't let the bugs bite through your armor."
His soldiers looked at each other, then silently nodded. A few moments later, Soul Reaper's voice rolled across the battlements once again with the command to attack. The special chutes built into the wall had mostly been destroyed or damaged, so the Awakened had to use other means to sortie into the killing field. Some rappelled down, some summoned memories capable of slowing one's fall. Some simply used the exposed framework of the Great Barrier to swiftly climb to the ground. The few surviving masters stationed on the southern wall went first to clear the landing. Saint mounted Nightmare, who leaped from one protruding sheet of deformed alloy to another, reaching the swarming abominations in mere seconds. Wielding the cruel sight, she quickly slaughtered the nearest enemies. Sunny wasn't far behind. He glided through the air using the dark wing, then dismissed it a couple dozen meters above the ground and plummeted down, landing among the nightmare creatures like a cannonball. The sin of Solace danced, effortlessly slicing through flesh and bone. It took Sunny only a few seconds to carve out a small island of safety. The members of his cohort joined him, forming a beachhead. More awakened followed behind them, grim determination shining in their eyes. Everyone knew that for many, if not most of them, this was going to be the last fight. Nevertheless, no one tried to flee or turn back. It's strange, cutting down a lunging beast. Sunny glanced at the descending awakened. Surely, all of them valued their lives. Maybe if left alone, most would listen to their fear and their desire to survive, and choose to save themselves instead. However, they had all been swept up in the moment and lost their reason. They were all individuals, but more than that. They were also parts of something much larger right now. A crowd, a mob, a collective had no fear of death, because the destruction of one of its small parts didn't mean the destruction of the whole. Maybe that was how these people suppressed their utterly natural and reasonable desire to live, knowing that even without them, the larger entity they belonged to would continue to exist. Was that what Professor Obel had meant when he said that humanity needed a bit of stupidity to survive? In any case, the feeling was alien to Sunny. He had spent most of his life being refused and rejected by the collective, so naturally, he valued himself more. There was really nothing more valuable than himself, and things he personally held dear. And yet, here he was, charging into the horde of nightmare creatures with the rest of the awakened of the First Army. Of course, his situation was vastly different. Sunny was pretty sure of his ability to at least escape alive, no matter what happened, but he was still taking a great risk for no apparent reason. Was it stubbornness? Was it pride? Was it spite and unwillingness to admit defeat? Or had he actually become infatuated by the same sense of collective responsibility as these selfless people? He truly didn't know, however. The word selfless seemed rather vile and frightening to Sunny. After all, his self was all he had. Without it, what was the point of staying alive? Gritting his teeth, Sunny brandished the sin of Solace and pushed forward, cutting through one abomination after another like a ruthless, eerily graceful butcher. At some point, his three shadows joined him, wrapping themselves around his body. The fourth one he had sent to help Nightmare. Sunny was surrounded by a fine haze of blood, but whenever drops of it fell on his black tunic, they rolled off the soft silk without leaving the slightest trace. The graceless dusk remained immaculately pristine. He left the hundreds of awakened behind and advanced into the horde, leading his cohort toward the river of black beetles. Luckily, it wasn't very hard to reach, because the dark river was flowing forward to meet them, as well, before the irregulars clashed with the claw of the heart of darkness. Though Bloodwave finally arrived at the battlefield, the mighty saint landed like a falling star, causing the earth to split and a shockwave to spread outward in all directions, away from water. Most of his powers would be of no use. But a Transcendent was still a Transcendent, wearing dark gray armor sewn of sharkskin and wielding two curved swords. Bloodwave instantly turned into a whirlwind of steel, moving with such speed and force as to resemble an annihilating blur. Countless nightmare creatures disappeared into it, and the blurry twister instantly turned red from the mass of blood. More than that, the champion of the House of Night was perfectly aware of his vulnerability on land. For that reason, his soul arsenal included many powerful memories to account for that weakness. Among other things, as soon as Bloodwave appeared, 3 echoes manifested by his side. One was a monstrous crab the size of a house, one resembled a towering golem of wet clay, and the last one was ethereal and elusive, like a creature made of fog. Sunny's eyes glinted when he realized that the creature shrouded in fog was actually Transcendent itself. It would have been powerless underwater. But here under the walls of Falcon Scott, the echo could exert truly devastating power. a small shadow fell from the sky, and a familiar black bird landed on Bloodwave's shoulder, cawing something into his ear. A moment later, the saint and his echoes changed direction, heading for one of the 4 rivers of darkness. Maybe we can actually pull this off. Throwing all unnecessary thoughts out of his head, Sunny concentrated on carving a path toward the tide of beetles. Somewhere behind him, hundreds of Awakened were desperately pushing against the horde of frenzied abominations, killing and dying without holding anything back. An ear-splitting groan of tearing metal thundered as another section of the wall collapsed, unable to withstand its own weight after suffering severe damage to its inner structure. He paid it no attention. How am I supposed to fight against the damned bugs? The Sin of Solace could cut through dozens with each swipe, but there were countless thousands of them. Trying to kill the entire swarm with a sword was no different from trying to cut the sea. He had a couple of tools capable of mass destruction: Shadow Manifestation, the Strike of Thunder. He could also control the swarm, somewhat, with the Dying Wish. Best of all, the beetles would have to try very, very hard to bite through the marble shell. Sunny wasn't too worried about his defense. It was the offense that posed an issue. I guess I'll just have to manage, somehow. A few moments later, the mass of nightmare creatures around them diminished, and those who did lunge at the cohort looked more panicked than consumed by bloodlust. It seemed that the heart of darkness cared not about whom it devoured, humans or abominations. And there, behind these last few monsters, the tide of darkness was rushing toward Sunny once again. As the river of darkness surged forward to devour Sunny, the small lantern of black stone hanging on his belt opened, and a tide of shadows rose from within it to meet the swarm of beetles. He held nothing back, unleashing every wild shadow he had tamed, from mundane and shallow ones to those that were ancient, vast, and unfathomably deep. The night itself seemed to move, as well. It moved to answer the call of the Master of Shadows. 2 dark tides met with a deafening thunder, and thousands of beetles were instantly broken, crushed, and ground into black dust. Some shadows were vanquished, too, and yet even more persisted, permeated by Sunny's essence. They were as deadly and resilient as an ascended weapon would be, with no sun and no moon to illuminate the skies. There was nothing but dim starlight, and a few distant flames, to chase away the darkness. The whole world was shrouded in shadows, and so, Sunny had an almost infinite well of them to call upon. The only limitation was his essence. However, the number of beetles was even more limitless, despite thousands of them being destroyed in the initial confrontation. It was no more than a drop in the ocean. Already, even more were surging forward, crashing into the wall of shadows and tunneling into it with their sharp mandibles, gritting his teeth. Sunny poured more essence out, strengthening the wall and turning it into a tall dam. Almost instantly, cracks appeared on its surface, and a moment later, the river of dark beetles overflowed, spilling over the top of the dam and spreading wide to encompass it from the sides, funneled by the Dying Wish. All of them rushed toward a single point: Sunny himself. Die. He launched himself forward, moving with enough speed to leave afterimages behind. The Sin of Solace lashed out, slicing through 24 beetles with a single strike, almost at the same time. A radiant orb of charged essence shot past Sunny and violently exploded in the surging mass of darkness. Samara had joined the fight, using her aspect ability directly instead of channeling it through the tungsten rounds of a rifle. Together, they managed to slow the beetles down a little. Sunny turned into a whirlwind of annihilating jade, delivering 6 swift attacks in an instant. However, even though cutting through the small creatures wasn't too hard, the effectiveness of these attacks was low. Almost instantly, he switched to using the flat of the jade blade to crush them with his strength. Each blow sent a concussive wave through the mass of dreadful pests, damaging and breaking their tough little bodies. His mind was split, one part commanding his body, the other controlling the manifested shadows to hold back the dark river. And yet, it wasn't enough. Damnation. No matter how fast Sunny moved and how many blows he delivered, the number of beetles was simply overwhelming. Already, many had flowed past him. Some tried to turn around to attack from behind, but the pressure of the thousands more pushing forward brought them away, forcing Belle, Dorn, and Kim to engage the creatures in melee. Out of the 3, Dorn was able to destroy the most with his aspect abilities and the heavy sledgehammer. Bell used himself as bait. Phasing from place to place and using his sword to cut down as many small creatures as he could, Kim, with her rapier and buckler, was the least suited for this battle, but she did her best to lessen the pressure on the two formidable warriors behind them. Samara continued to charge small beads of alloy with essence and flick them into the mass of beetles, each streaking through the air like a bullet and exploding into a wave of destructive force. Once her supply of alloy beads and needles was exhausted, she would have to use the crudest form of attack and simply toss out projectiles formed of unrestrained, wild essence. They were holding, for now, but the tide of dark beetles was growing more and more overbearing with each moment. Their number endlessly swelled, and the dam of shadows was being continuously destroyed and rebuilt, consuming Sunny's essence like a gluttonous beast, some distance away to his right. Bloodwave and his echoes had engaged another tentacle of the heart of darkness. To his left, Saint and Nightmare were holding back the third, and further still, behind them, Jet and her cohort were fighting the fourth. This isn't working. This isn't enough. Sunny knew that, if nothing changed, he and his soldiers would be devoured by the appalling vermin. Already, many of the dark beetles had gotten past his defenses and bitten into his skin. Their sharp mandibles only left shallow scratches on it, which almost immediately healed. But still, the memory of one of these vile creatures crawling inside his rib cage made him shudder. It was only a matter of time before several bites would turn into a dozen, then 100, then 1,000. Would the marble shell be able to withstand countless thousands of mandibles plunging into it? Even if it did, it was only his skin that was so resilient. Once he was buried under a cold, slithering carpet of darkness, the beetles crawling into his mouth, into his nostrils, into his ears, into his eyes, would he be devoured from within? The Sin of Solace laughed. Wouldn't that be a sight to behold? Yes, yes, it would. I can't wait. Uttering a silent curse, Sunny tried to pay the whispers of the Jade Sword no attention and concentrated on eviscerating as many of the beetles as he could. I need to think of something. He could always use Shadow Step to escape. No, not quite. The last time, a few beetles were pulled along with him as he stepped through the shadows, most likely because the small creatures weren't, in fact, alive, not alive. A bizarre idea suddenly appeared in his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. Even if it worked, he would only be buying himself a few seconds of respite at most. What Sunny really needed was to enhance his offensive ability, to find a way to destroy much more beetles every moment. However, he was only human. There was only so much that his small body, no matter how strong, could do. No, his best hope was shadow manifestation. He was already using it to hold the river back and grind many beetles into dust. But that wasn't enough. Was there anything else he could do? Summoning a dozen shadow hands to crush and obliterate the beetles would work, for a bit, but it would also burn his reserves of essence with terrible speed. Those hands wouldn't be able to strike with as much strength as he himself could. As well. Damn it, if Serpent was here, I could have ordered it to assume the form of a massive monster and crush thousands of the damned vermin with each step. Consumed by revulsion and fear at the thought of being eaten from the inside, driven to his limits and desperate to find a way to defeat the river of darkness, at that feverish moment, Sunny suddenly felt something click in his head, scraps and pieces of previously accumulated experiences connected together, forming a tentative hint of a revelation. The revelation was strange, unclear, and dubious. That shouldn't be possible, right? However, he really couldn't see why not. Sunny sensed the endless ocean of formless shadows around him, all malleable and ready to answer his call. If Soul Serpent wasn't here to assume the shape of a dreadful monster, why not try to turn into one himself? The formless ability allowed Soul Serpent to assume the shape of any shadow contained within its master's soul, as long as it was the shadow of a creature that was of the same or lower class and rank. Once transformed, Serpent wouldn't only look like the creature, but also inherit its traits and abilities. Sunny, however, wasn't the Serpent, while he trained his mind and body to possess some facets of the formlessness of shadows. he was still a human. Even if he used Shadow Step to turn incorporeal, he wouldn't be able to make use of the same mystical ability. He could, however, command the shadows and manifest them into tangible forms. What did it mean? Slowly drowning in the tide of black beetles and feeling their sharp mandibles scrape against his skin, Sunny continued to fight and think. His thoughts were desperate and feverish, but at the same time his mind was strangely calm. His first uses of shadow manifestation had been very simple, nothing more than shapeless shadows turned tangible and pushed into motion. The only form they had was the one caused by the motion itself, and so they looked like dark tentacles. Later, Sunny trained for a long time to be able to effortlessly manipulate the shadows into more structured shapes. Chains, blades, walls, and a few more. With those, he had made several incredible achievements, building a bridge over a vast chasm, stopping the advance of a mighty titan. Weren't things a master was supposed to be capable of doing? However, his crowning achievement in the use of shadow manifestation was the shadow hands, although not as powerful, durable, and numerous as the dark chains Sunny could create. They were vastly more complex and intricately structured. A hand had to have a rigid frame, flexible joints, dozens of degrees of freedom, and many more aspects that few people ever stopped to consider. Controlling one was also much more complicated. Currently, Sunny could skillfully implement two types of shadow hands. The cruder and larger ones acted as an independent fighting force during battles, while the much more agile ones, scaled to the size of his body, were used to give him an extra pair of hands for complicated tasks. So, if he could already create hands and arms, what was to stop him from shaping shadows into a full creature? Sunny growled as he was pushed back by the river of darkness, wide cracks appearing on the dam he had created. Behind him, Belle, Dorn, and Kim were barely holding on against the ever-increasing number of the vile beetles. Just at that moment, Dorn was a split second too slow to bring his sledgehammer down, and one of the small creatures landed on his armor. The enchanted metal instantly split, but before the beetle could burrow under the giant man's skin, Kim's rapier flashed and pierced the beetle. The sharp blade wounded Dorn as well, but receiving a shallow cut was infinitely better than having a murderous little creature tear through his insides. Sunny gritted his teeth, striking down with the sin of solace. What was to stop him? The answer was very simple: complexity. Even shaping a functioning hand was already incomparably hard. He had spent a lot of time teaching himself how to shape shadows into hands on the fly. Creating an actual moving construct in the form of a creature would have been 100, if not 1,000 times harder. Plus, such a creature wouldn't be very deadly, since in the end, it would just be a more complicated ascended weapon. There was something that could solve both of these problems in Sunny's possession, though. His knowledge of shadow dance. Shadow dance allowed him to observe a person or a creature and learn the very essence of their style and physicality, then shadow it, how they moved, how they thought, how they felt, how soul essence flowed through their body. Of course, none of that would be possible if he didn't first understand the structure of the body itself. If Sunny knew how a body was shaped and worked on an instinctual level, the task of forcing shadows into that form would become much easier. Additionally, he didn't have to make that form act independently, to translate his own power through it instead of relying solely on the strength of the shadows themselves. He could build it around himself like a shell. He could wrap it around his body like his own shadows wrapped around it. It's like a suit of exoskeleton armor in the shape of a nightmare creature, a shell of shadows, with me powering it instead of the other way around. If he succeeded, he would be able to assume the shape of a nightmare creature, just like Soul Serpent could. Of course, there would be a vast difference. Unlike his shadow, Sunny wouldn't inherit the creature's attributes and abilities, but the physical form itself was already enough. He took a deep breath, almost swallowing one of the beetles. A savage expression appeared on Sunny's face, and he flinched back, narrowly avoiding the lunging pest. Would he really be able to pull this off? There's only one way to find out. To attempt something like that, though, Sunny needed two things. First, he had to choose a suitable form and one that was exceedingly familiar to him. The better he knew the shape of a creature, the higher his chances of success would be, and even though he had shadowed many abominations over the years, there were very few that Sunny was confident in recreating. Secondly, he needed some time, with nothing to distract him from the task, even if it was just a few seconds. Attempting something that crazy for the first time couldn't be done in the middle of a furious melee. Sunny could come up with some monster to try turning into, but several seconds of peace were much harder to come by, unless... The bizarre idea that he had thought of some time ago suddenly popped back into his mind. He crushed 100 beetles with an obliterating strike of the flat of his jade sword, then continued to rain one attack after another on the inexhaustible river of vermin, summoning a new memory at the same time. Soon, a large alloy chest appeared in front of Sunny, large enough for him to comfortably lie on. It was the covetous coffer. Sunny commanded the memory to open its lid, then pushed it on the side and swiftly hid behind it. He also called back the deepest and most ancient shadows unleashed from the shadow lantern, hoping to shape them into a monstrous form. The coffer was a storage memory, and by now its capacity was rather large. After months spent in Antarctica, that space was mostly empty. All kinds of things could be stored inside the alloy chest, with two restrictions. The things couldn't be too big and they couldn't be alive. The black beetles, though, weren't alive. Sunny didn't know what they were, but since the creatures could travel with him through Shadow Step, which suffered from a similar limitation, there was a good reason to believe that the coffer would be able to swallow them as well, and it did. Positioned between the tide of black beetles and Sunny, who wore the dying wish, the alloy chest was like a bottomless abyss. A river of the vile creatures flowed into it, hoping to tear through the bottom of the coffer and get to the human hiding behind it. However, all of them simply disappeared into the spatial storage space instead. A second passed, and then another, with countless thousands of beetles entering the dark chasm of the coffer's maw and never appearing again. After one more second, though, the storage space started to overflow. The lid of the chest instantly snapped shut, and then the memory dissipated into a whirlwind of white sparks. The river of beetles surged forward to devour the human. What rose from the veil of sparks, however, wasn't a human at all. Instead, it was a fearsome creature that towered at almost 3 meters in height, with onyx black skin and a bestial, demonic face. Its mouth was full of sharp fangs, and 4 long horns crowned its head, protruding from dark, coarse hair. The creature had 4 hands that ended with sharp claws and a long, twisting tail. Its eyes were entirely black, with no irises and 2 vertical, furious pupils. A terrifying growl escaped from its mouth, full of triumph. Of course, Sunny had chosen the shape of a creature he was most familiar with, the Shadowspawn Devil. Sunny had spent many long months in the body of the nameless Shadow Spawn, from the bloody floor of the Red Colosseum to the burning streets of the Ivory City. He had fought countless battles with the creature's 4-clawed hands. However, he had never experienced being the Shadow Devil as an ascended, possessing the power of a master and augmented by shadows. He exploded with truly terrifying might, at 3 meters of height. Sunny had suddenly turned into a vicious herald of destruction. He lunged into the mass of dark beetles, eviscerating hundreds of them in a split second. He was holding a sword in each of his 4 hands. 2 of them were the Sin of Solace and the Midnight Shard, and 2 were shaped from shadows. Each moved with staggering speed, weaving a translucent sphere of devastation in the river of darkness. Fighting with 4 swords was, perhaps, not the best idea against most opponents. However, Sunny didn't need a lot of control and agility to deal with the beetles. All he needed was speed, more attacks, no matter how crude. With 4 swords and longer reach, the rate at which he destroyed the vile creatures increased tremendously. He cut and crushed them with his 4 swords, stomped them with his clawed feet. Even his tail was swiping through the swarm, obliterating many beetles. For a few moments, the river of darkness seemed to slow its advance. Sunny used those moments to slaughter even more, alleviating the pressure on his cohort and allowing Samara to renew her bombardment of charged essence. The strangest thing about it was how comfortable he felt, even while shaping the shadows into the form of the Shadow Devil. Sunny had no idea of how easy or hard it would be to control that shell. As it turned out, it felt almost indistinguishable from the real thing. All he needed to do was summon the memories of the second nightmare into his mind, and bring them to life with the help of Shadow Dance, like shadowing a memory of a creature instead of the creature itself. Of course, the demands were high. He needed to know the shape of the shadow shell in startling detail. Sunny suspected that he wouldn't have been able to turn himself into many other creatures, if any at all, however. His knowledge of the Shadowspawn was nothing short of instinctual. Instead of controlling the construct consciously, he simply allowed himself to become it. The other demand was essence. Sustaining the shadow shell burned through it with dire speed. His reserves weren't exhausted yet, but he knew he wouldn't be able to keep being the Shadowspawn for long. He had to do a lot of other things, as well, like power his memories and manifest more and more shadows to repair the tall dam. The situation had improved, but they were still on a timer. If nothing changed soon, the result would be disastrous. Don't think about it right now, just kill. Kill as many as you can. The damned beetles have to have a breakpoint, too. Everything turned into pure chaos. Sunny felt as though his physical power was almost uncontrollable now. He pushed and pushed himself, expecting to hit a limit. But that limit never came. His speed, his strength, his force, all of it had vastly increased, to the point where his thoughts were starting to fall behind his movements. Countless thousands of beetles were destroyed, faced with the hurricane of swords, claws, horns, and fangs. The river actually recoiled. Giving up several meters of frozen soil, Sunny thrust one of the shadow swords forward and let go of it at some point. Instead, arcs of electricity appeared on his palm, and then formed into an arrow that seemed to be made of lightning. Sunny stabbed it into the mass of beetles, causing an incinerating chain reaction to destroy numerous creatures. He was hurt by the devastating current of electricity, as well. But due to the elemental resistance of the marble shell and the augmentation of the shadows, the damage was superficial and almost tolerable. There was no time to think, only to fight. Somehow, miraculously, Sunny was holding the swarm of the black beetles back. The dying wish was pulling them toward him like a magnet, but instead of washing the towering shadow devil away like a dark tide, they were being constantly ground to dust, cut to pieces, and incinerated by lightning as soon as they entered within his reach. Those that flowed past Sunny were dealt with by the members of his cohort. Samara was causing one explosion after another to bloom amid the swarm, while Luster fed her a steady flow of essence. Both were nearing their limit, but they hadn't reached it yet. The same was true for Belle, Dorn, and Kim. Sunny couldn't see Saint and Nightmare, but from the glimpses of how little progress the second swarm had made, he knew that they were doing their part. As well, the third swarm, the one Bloodwave was supposed to deal with, seemed the most damaged. The three echoes were holding it back, but the fearsome Saint himself was nowhere to be seen. He was probably hidden somewhere within the River of Darkness, fighting furiously. Since the echoes hadn't dissipated, he had to be alive, at least. The only ones Sunny knew nothing about were Soul Reaper and her cohort, since they were too far away. Still, he believed that Master Jet wouldn't go down easily. Keep fighting, keep fighting. Sunny could feel his shadow shell slowly coming undone. After long minutes of rampaging within the dark river of vermin, it had sustained a lot of damage. He tried to repair the wound delivered to the towering shadow devil by summoning and manifesting more shadows, but many beetles were already crawling within. Their mandibles scraped against the silk of the graceless dusk or his skin from time to time. Fruitlessly for now. His every muscle was burning from strain, and his mind was becoming clouded from fatigue. It took a lot to keep the shadow shell intact and moving. He had to let the dam crumble a couple of minutes ago, already, because the pressure of it all was just too demanding. Nevertheless, Sunny kept fighting. In fact, the more tired and fatigued he became, the fiercer his rampage grew, and the louder the sin of Solace laughed, whispering ugly truths into his ears. Y'all never make it. Give up. Leave your soldiers to die and save yourself. Come on. It's so easy. Just turn into a shadow and slip away. No one will know, no one will tell, everyone will just die. How irritating. Sunny tossed the strike of thunder into the surging mass of beetles once again, enduring the piercing pain of being electrocuted by its lightning, and felt one of his two shadow hands crumble down. Ah, not good. He prepared to summon a new shadow to reshape it. But then something changed. A strange ripple went through the river of darkness and it suddenly lost cohesion. The purposeful tide of black beetles grew discordant and shapeless, many of them simply growing still. Some continued to throw themselves at Sunny, while others scurried away. Nestled within the battered shadow shell, he blinked. What just happened? Tired, so tired, Sunny smashed through the nearest beetles and jumped back, sliding a few dozens of meters across the ground as his claws left deep grooves in the frozen soil to slow him down. In front of him, the river of darkness was falling apart. The dark beetles, who had been acting like a single organism before, were now aimless and sluggish. Some grew lethargic or started burrowing into the ground, while others were wandering away. A few hundred were still pursuing him. With a thought, Sunny deactivated the dying wish and watched the small creatures dash away in fear. The swarm ceased its purposeful advance and instead flowed outward, losing the shape of a giant tentacle of darkness. It was as though a tank of water had been broken, water spilling to the sides. Utterly, chillingly exhausted, Sunny panted heavily inside the shadow shell. There were several beetles still crawling within it, stubbornly trying to bite through his skin. However, even their vicious bites had grown less determined. The breaking point, did they reach it? His tired mind wanted nothing more than to release the manifested shadows and let the shadow devil form crumble into nothingness. But he forced himself to remain vigilant, looking left and right. Sunny saw that the two neighboring swarms were in a similar condition. This was good news, but also bad, now that the heart of darkness was acting directionless. Its deterrence seemed to have lost most of its power. The horde of nightmare creatures, which had been scared away by the dark beetles, was already starting to tentatively move closer to the group of humans. Crap. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment, then turned around and took a few steps toward the members of his cohort, who were similarly spent and battered. His soldiers, however, recoiled away from him. He looked down in confusion for a moment. Oh. With that, Sunny finally let the shadows comprising the Shadowspawn return to their natural form and flow back into the intricately engraved lantern hanging on the black silken cord tied around his waist. The towering four-armed devil suddenly crumbled into a cloud of darkness, and a pale young man in a beautiful black tunic stepped out of it with a stagger. Arg. Sunny fell to his knees, then raised his fist and angrily struck the ground several times, crushing the scurrying beetles. "Sea Captain, is that why you?" He glanced at Kim, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Of course, it's me. Who else would it be? And it's Major now, damn it." He slowly stood up and summoned the endless spring, taking several large gulps of cold, refreshing water. Perhaps dismissing the shadow shell outside the city wall wasn't the wisest decision, but he felt that he wouldn't be able to sustain it much longer. At least that way, he would have a tiny bit of essence left for whatever it was that would happen next. The wall. Sunny looked back, finally witnessing the full scope of the damage done to the defensive barrier. The southern span of the wall was terribly deformed and broken, with many sections laying in giant piles of broken, melted alloy, much more of them than when he had left it. Somewhere beside it, hidden by the sea of abominations, the awakened of the First Army was still holding the horde back. He wondered how many of them were still alive. What's going on? Why did the heart of darkness suddenly stop beating? Where the hell are? Shaken, he looked to his left, where Saint and Nightmare and Soul Reaper's cohort had fought. His shadows were already approaching, both littered with wounds. Neither had perished, but they did sustain a lot of damage. Even Saint, who was transcendent and thus much more durable than Sunny, had suffered dreadfully while battling the swarm of black beetles. Maybe because the small creatures were especially proficient at gnawing through stone. The mantle of darkness was slow to repair the damage. As well, almost as if Saint's internal source of true darkness was as exhausted as Sunny's reservoir of essence. Her wounds were healing, nevertheless, just not at all as fast as he would have wanted. There was one more figure making its way toward him. As well, Sunny felt extremely relieved when he recognized Jet. Soul Reaper didn't look good. Her armor seemed to have been destroyed at some point during the battle. And now, she wore only the uniform bodysuit, its smart fabric wet and heavy with blood. Her face was ashen. In a few heartbeats, all three arrived. In the same span of time, the nightmare creatures started to draw closer, madness and hunger burning in their eyes.
Mr. Jet, what happened? Why did the bugs suddenly?
I am all right. It was Bloodwave. He fought his way to the center of the swarm and killed the thing in charge.
How and what exactly did he kill?
She shook her head and admitted that she didn't know. It was only then that Sunny realized that Soul Reaper was alone. He hesitated for a moment, then asked about her cohort. Jet gritted her teeth and said that they were dead. Then she pushed herself off of him and straightened. The Ascended that were supposed to reinforce us are also dead. They couldn't fight their way through the Horde, and speaking of the Horde, we need to get the hell out of here, fast. We need to reach the secondary defense line really soon. Otherwise, Army Command is probably going to blow us all up. Sunny froze for a moment. Someone murmured something about the Rampart Protocol. The First Army, of course, had all kinds of contingencies. There were a few set in place in case the city wall fell, too, from relatively tame to really drastic. The Rampart Protocol was the most drastic of them all. There were tunnels dug below the killing field, and under the span of abandoned streets between the city wall and the secondary defense line, as well. All of them were chock full of powerful explosives, most of them created with the use of spell tech. All those explosives were set up to go up in flames together, turning everything outside the secondary barrier into a vast, scorching inferno. That measure was only supposed to be implemented after every soldier had safely retreated into the safety zone, and most of them already had. Army Command would probably wait for Sunny, Jet, and especially Bloodwave to return before pulling the trigger, but the situation was extremely chaotic, and communications were down. There was just no telling for sure. A voice breathed a curse of damnation. Sunny glanced to his right and saw a battered Echo. The other two must have been destroyed, and a fearsome figure in sharkskin armor emerged from the mass of dark beetles and dashed toward them. Some distance behind the pair, a mass of abominations were already lunging forward. He looked back at Jet and grinned. Then what the hell are we waiting for? Run! Bloodwave reached them just a moment later. The mighty saint looked spent. Sunny shivered when he noticed that his armor was torn and there were ugly injuries covering his body. Out of the three Echoes, only the monstrous crab remained. The other two had either been destroyed or dismissed to save them from perishing. Even the Transcendent Echo is gone. Gods, what could have destroyed one of those and severely injured a saint? The Heart of Darkness. Just what kind of creature was it? He felt a bit of dread and a bit of curiosity. However, now wasn't the time to ask questions. Their small party had to hurry and fight their way back through the boundless horde of nightmare creatures. 5 awakened, 2 masters, 1 saint, as well as 2 powerful shadows and an Echo. They were an exceedingly formidable group. Granted, all of them were wounded, tired, and low on essence. Still, cutting through the horde while keeping everyone alive wouldn't pose a problem, in theory. Bloodwave studied the rest for a moment, then sent his Echo forward and growled, his voice husky, low, and domineering, telling them to move. Saint spared the mighty saint an indifferent glance, then mounted Nightmare and sent the Dark Destrier into a gallop, the spearhead of the cruel sight igniting with the incandescent white glow in her hand, a shield made of pure darkness weighing on the other. They moved ahead of the party, cutting into the horde as a fierce vanguard. Soul Reaper was just behind, accompanied by the members of Sunny's cohort. Bloodwave and his Echo flanked the awakened, protecting them from the frenzied nightmare creatures. Sunny himself took up the rear position, dragging his tired body along and preventing the abominations from attacking the backs of his soldiers. In a cacophony of chilling howls, they dove into the mass of abominations. Blood, severed flesh, and fragments of broken bone instantly filled the air. Damn it, damn it. Damn it. No one in the group was weak, and some of them were truly powerful. However, the horde that Goliath had brought to the walls of Falcon Scott was simply too vast. Countless nightmare creatures were throwing themselves at the exhausted humans in a rabid frenzy. Every moment, from every direction. Slowing down meant being buried under a mountain of monstrous bodies and torn apart. Their only chance was to cut through the mass of abominations faster than the abominations could pile up on them. Sunny continued to fight with his teeth gritted. The rearguard position was the most awkward, because he had to move backwards at considerable speed while slaughtering the mass of nightmare creatures pursuing the party. By now, they were deep inside the horde, and the abominations were surrounding them on all sides. With how sharp and swift the Sin of Solace was, no creature could resist its blade. Sunny was managing somehow, for now, but his battered body was hurting all over. Even though the marble shell had yet to succumb to an attack, the few blows he failed to dodge or deflect still delivered some damage. It was only his skin that was as hard as stone, after all, not his entire body. A sufficiently powerful strike would send a concussive shock through his insides, potentially causing internal organs to rupture. That hadn't happened yet, but being hit still hurt. What the hell? It just never ends, does it? Today, he had killed a titan and faced a creature that might have been even more wicked. Despite it all, the hard part wasn't over. The fact that everything around him could blow at any moment, plunging the whole place into an inferno of immolating flame, both mundane and magical, didn't make Sunny feel any better either. Slowly, the ruined walls of the siege capital drew closer. Bloodwave's echo was almost destroyed. Causing the saint to dismiss it, Master Jet took its place with a resigned expression, her wounds starting to bleed again. The somber glaive was nowhere to be seen. But a slender Naginata appeared in Soul Reaper's hands instead. Using it, she cleared the right flank of the formation with several vicious strikes. The pressure on Sunny was also increasing. By now, he was forced to support himself with shadow manifestation from time to time. His already pitiful reserve of essence was diminishing even further with each use. And yet, they continued to cut through the horde unimpeded, the ground slick with blood under their feet. After what felt like 1,000 years of slaughter, the party finally reached the melted ruin of the city wall. In front of it, the awakened force in charge of the southern section was holding back the ocean of nightmare creatures. What was left of it, at least. A grim expression settled on Sunny's face when he realized that of the initial 700. Perhaps only 200 remained. Reuniting with the line of awakened soldiers gave them a moment of respite, and gave the desperate soldiers a much-needed morale boost. Soul Reaper, Mongrel, and Devil, all three were famous champions of the First Army, and although few soldiers knew what Saint Bloodwave looked like, the Transcendent of the House of Night had a presence that made it impossible to mistake him for an ordinary person. Seeing them return alive from the sortie, the awakened regained some of their spirit. No one was out of the woods yet, though. There was a large distance separating the wall from the secondary defense perimeter that had been established deep within the city. That whole abandoned area was set up to go up in flames. As well, Sunny looked through one of the numerous breaches in the deformed wall, noticing that the staging area on the other side of it had already been evacuated. The mundane soldiers had retreated, taking the logistics personnel, medical officers, technicians, engineers, and all other non-combatants with them. The vast resources stored inside the staging area were all left behind: tall crates of MWP munitions, carcasses of slain nightmare creatures, loader robots, and so on. A wealth of supplies, much of it highly flammable or outright explosive, was going to be blown up once the Rampart Protocol was initiated. 2. Usually, Sunny would have been pained to see all these riches go to waste, but right now, he didn't care. All he cared about wasn't being near when they did. Right now, we just have to get to the secondary defense line. Once we're within the city instead of on a plane, evading the abominations should be much easier. So the last stretch of the way won't be as hard. Sunny glanced at his companions, evaluating their state. Everyone was exhausted, dirty, and covered in blood, both their own and that of nightmare creatures, but alive. The only problem now was to somehow extricate themselves. And the 200 surviving awakened from the attacking horde. At that moment, as if to answer his thoughts, Bloodwave turned to look at the mass of abominations. Then, the enigmatic saint glanced at Master Jet. "Take your soldiers and go, Soul Reaper. I will hold the beasts back for a bit. Tell your commanders to activate the explosives as soon as you are past the defense line." Sunny stared at him in shock, feeling that these words sounded a bit like a farewell. You.
I think you might have misunderstood, Sunless. I am not trying to sacrifice myself. It's just that an explosion like that won't harm a Transcendent too much. The Awakened, however, or even someone like you, better not risk it. Sunny slowly nodded. Indeed, corrupted nightmare creatures could survive a nuclear explosion without too much trouble. Some fallen as well. Rampart Protocol wasn't going to kill a Transcendent like Bloodwave, or even seriously inconvenience him. Master Jet nodded. They would be going. Then the saint nodded, then took a deep breath and started summoning several memories. Sunny didn't know what exactly the memories were. But judging by the fact that Bloodwave had promised to hold back the horde, the whole horde all by himself, the abominations were in for a nasty surprise. Jet looked at him, then said quietly, "Once we start running, don't stop until you are safely behind the army fortifications. I'll stay back a little, to make sure that everyone who's still alive gets safely out of the blast zone before Army Command begins the party. Expect to enjoy fireworks as soon as we see each other again."
Going to be terribly loud, isn't it? Damn my poor ears. With that, he spared her one last glance and turned to his cohort. "Come on, go."
Almost as soon as they dashed toward the nearest breach in the wall, Master Jet's voice boomed once again, spreading across the whole length of the battlefield with the order to retreat. The surviving Awaken of the First Army didn't make her ask twice, delivering one last attack. They used their remaining strength to momentarily push the enemy back, then turned around and ran. To call it a retreat was a bit of a stretch. There was no order or strategy to it. Just a desperate wish to survive. The defense line instantly collapsed, and the soldiers dove into the ruins of the city wall, their backs to the enemy. The only saving grace of the whole thing was Bloodwave, who somehow managed to fulfill his promise and stall the enormous horde of nightmare creatures all by himself, at least for a few moments. What happened outside the wall next? Sunny didn't know. He thought that he heard the roar of a rushing tide of water, but at that point, there was no time to turn around. Sunny and his cohort flashed through the abandoned staging area and escaped into the empty streets beyond. Here, everything was shrouded in darkness. Many buildings had collapsed, creating a complicated labyrinth of snow and broken concrete. Others still stood, but were charred black by the flames. Some streets were strangely untouched and eerily empty. And of course, there were functioning roads that the First Army had maintained to deliver people and supplies to the wall. Sunny led his people to one of these roads. Luckily, all of them could see in the dark thanks to Kim, so the lack of illumination wasn't a problem. Their running speed wasn't much lower than that of a moving PTV, but nevertheless, he felt a pang of regret for a moment. I am going to lose the Rhino. His reliable APC was currently parked in a different section of the staging area, near where they had started their shift. Sadly, the battle had taken them far away from the main gate of the city, so there was no time to search for the mighty vehicle. Once this whole place blew up, the Rhino would undoubtedly be destroyed. As well, damn it, damn it. Gritting his teeth, Sunny continued to run. He had to lead his people to safety. That took priority over everything else. Currently, they were slightly ahead of the rest of the retreating Awakened. The span of the southern section was very long, so no one else was in view. Right now, all that mattered was speed, and each soldier was making their own path to the secondary defense line. Sunny suspected that most would try to reach the maintained roads, but on this one, there was no one but the battered cohort of irregulars. Burned and collapsed buildings flew past them one after another. They ran through the darkness, moving as fast as they could, their stamina long spent and their lungs burning. The dark, empty streets, something about them filled Sunny with a feeling of eerie unease. It took him a couple of minutes to realize why the surroundings felt so strange. It was too quiet, after more than 2 weeks of the siege. Sunny had grown accustomed to always hearing the wall armaments roaring somewhere in the distance, but those armaments had grown silent now, destroyed by the fiery gaze of Goliath, at least across the whole southern section of the defensive barrier. Not a single turret was firing, for some reason. The silence filled him with dread. Almost there, just a few more minutes. Sunny spread his shadow sense outward, just to make sure that there were no dangers around. He even sent 2 of his shadows to scour the path ahead to be safe, and ordered Saint and Nightmare to stay alert. But there was nothing there, just abandoned buildings and snow-covered ruins. Sunny didn't see anything that could pose a threat to the cohort. His shadow didn't see anything either. Neither did Nightmare and Saint. The only one to notice it was Luster, who just happened to turn his head in the direction the attack came from by pure luck. His eyes widened. It was a split second later that Sunny sensed it, a swift shadow flying toward the cohort, even though there was nothing there to cast it. But it was already too late for him to react. In the next moment, Luster suddenly lunged forward and pushed Kim aside, throwing her to the ground. Something flashed through the cold air, and it was instantly filled with hot blood. Something broke the dark surface of the shadows and flew into the cold air, moving fast enough to look like a black blur before anyone could react. Kim was falling down, and so was Luster, who had pushed her aside at the last moment. There was blood in the air, a startled expression on his face, and something was very wrong with the way he was falling. The black blur didn't stop. A sharp blade instantly flashed toward Dorn, who had a startled expression on his face. The giant man only had enough time to slightly turn his torso. The blade missed his heart, slicing through armor and leaving a deep wound on his chest. The blade continued forward without pause, a split second away from piercing Bell's head. Instead, it simply passed through it. The swordsman couldn't possibly dodge. But he just barely managed to activate his aspect ability and phase through the strike, leaving Samara utterly open. Everything happened too fast. Before Kim even hit the ground, the enemy's blade was already mere centimeters away from slashing across her throat. However, a jade sword suddenly appeared in its way, blocking the lightning-fast attack. What the? Sunny, who had thrown himself in the path of the enemy, was tossed back by the ferocious force of the impact. The attacker, whoever it was so strong that his hands grew slightly numb. He collapsed on the scorched road and rolled, instantly jumping back to his feet. Kim landed on the ground. Luster did too. Both of his legs were cleanly severed at the knee, and blood was pouring out of terrible wounds. Sunny's eyes widened, but he had no time to think about it. The members of the cohort were too slow to defend themselves, and the ambush wasn't yet over. The creature, a dark silhouette moving with dire speed, had been thrown back. As well, Sunny only had enough time to notice a humanoid shape clad in black armor and instantly lunged forward. He had regained his balance a split second faster than the attacker, so the bastard had no way to avoid being pierced by the sin of solace. And yet, that was exactly what happened. Before the jade sword could strike the creature down, it simply dissipated into the shadows. Sunny asked, "What?" Sunny was stupefied for a short moment. It's shadow step, which meant. He spun, but was a moment too late. The creature was already behind him, the black blade falling from above. Sunny gritted his teeth, then blocked the strike with his forearm. The marble shell turned as hard as stone and split open, broken by the vicious strength of the blow. The blade only managed to deliver a relatively minor wound, though most of its power spent to shatter the shell before Sunny could counterattack. The enemy had blinked out of existence once again. Not good. The creature appeared some distance away, aiming to finish off Kim. At that point, however, Saint was already there. The taciturn knight had leapt from Nightmare's back and flashed across the road, deflecting the black blade with her shield. Inconceivably, the onyx shield actually cracked, and the shadow staggered back. The creature didn't waste any time and lunged toward Kim. But then, a black chain suddenly wrapped around its throat, a dozen meters away. Sunny grasped the shadow chain and jerked it back with all his strength. The enemy was thrown back, flying through the air and crashing on the road a few meters behind him. The creature slid back, then stopped, kneeling in the middle of the road. It remained motionless for a moment, and then slowly stood up, glancing at Sunny with cold, killing intent. Subjected to the hate-filled gaze, Sunny turned grim. The creature was about 2 meters tall, with plates of jet-black bone covering its body like a full suit of armor. Even its face was hidden behind black bone, which formed a menacing closed helmet. 2 inhuman dark eyes burned with resentment and hatred through the cracks. The lower part of the helmet was split by a jagged line, and when it parted, a maw full of sharp fangs was revealed. Opened in a mocking grin, Sunny, who was standing between the cohort and the abomination, grimaced and lowered his gaze a little. In one of its hands, the creature was holding a curved sword that seemed to have been crudely carved from a long black tusk, its edge terribly sharp and harder than steel. Just as he had thought, the abomination was missing 2 fingers on the other. Sunny sighed, lingered for a moment, and then said tiredly, "I had a feeling that you would show up." The scary stories about a murderous shadow that people in Falcon Scott had been telling each other turned out to be more than just stories. In the end, it seemed that the little scavenger had grown once again. Curse it. Of course, the wretched goblin would choose this exact moment to attack. Why wouldn't he? Sunny was tired, beaten, and very low on essence. The First Army was in full retreat, and none of his allies could intervene on his behalf. If Sunny was planning an ambush, that would have been exactly how he'd do it. Well, not quite. He wouldn't have failed to kill most of his marks during the first assault, not letting the scavenger out of his sight. Sunny briefly glanced at his soldiers. Luster seemed to be in shock, weakly trying to sit up. Kim was by his side, hastily applying a tourniquet. Bell, Samara, and Dorn were shielding them with their bodies, their faces grim and tense. The latter was bleeding from a deep wound on his chest. Saint and Nightmare were waiting for his command, ready to attack. Bad, bad, this is very bad. Sunny had already taken a glance at the scavenger's soul, finding out that the damned waif had somehow managed to become a corrupted devil. The goblin, well, the bastard was more of an ogre now, must have devoured a lot of nightmare creatures to become that strong. He must have devoured a lot of people, as well, considering how disturbingly human-like the scavenger now looked. There must have been a lot of bodies left in the ruins of Erebus Field. And more victims still here in Falcon Scott, much worse. It seemed that swallowing a piece of Sunny's flesh allowed the creature to inherit some of his powers related to shadows. Dealing with an enemy like that would have been hard even if the cohort was in peak shape. But now, it was going to be a problem. Not a big problem, of course. However, one thing made the situation truly dire. The whole section of the city around them, the road, the buildings, the ruins, was about to be destroyed by a titanic explosion. For a few moments, no one moved. Sunny was considering how to deal with the scavenger, while the scavenger was probably considering how to deal with Sunny, now that the ambush had partially failed. Or maybe the damn thing was simply enjoying seeing him squirm. Who could tell what was happening in that abominable head? 100 thoughts flew through Sunny's mind. No matter how he looked at it, the situation didn't look good. He had no doubt that he and his two shadows were more than enough to kill the scavenger. After all, plenty of corrupted abominations had fallen by his hand, but would they be able to kill him fast enough? The wretched creature was strong and extremely slippery. Fighting someone who could teleport all over the place was a real nightmare. Belatedly, Sunny felt pity for all the poor bastards whom he had killed in the past. They must have all died full of frustration. Serves them right. Once Army Command set off the explosives below the city, Saint would probably be able to survive the conflagration. Just like Bloodwave had said he would, Nightmare and Sunny had a chance to escape unscathed, too, if they managed to find a shadow deep enough to protect them. His soldiers, however, wouldn't. They weren't saints, or even ascended. Neither did they possess aspects capable of saving them from the destruction. Not to mention that Luster was gravely injured and losing a lot of blood. As an awakened, he wouldn't bleed out immediately, but getting him to a medic, or better yet an actual healer, was an urgent priority. The problem was that Sunny wasn't confident in his ability to protect the cohort if they chose to retreat. Once again, an enemy who could step through shadows was simply too mobile and unpredictable. Guarding a bunch of vulnerable targets from a corrupted devil who could appear at any moment, from any side, was a tall task. Damn it. Damn it. Not only did the bastard get a chunk of my flesh, he even became an utter menace because of it. They couldn't remain and fight, and they couldn't retreat. Did the bastard actually know that everything around them was about to blow up? Or had he just been lucky to catch Sunny at the worst possible moment? If he had, that was some luck. The scavenger tilted his head a little, as though challenging Sunny to come and get him. The tip of his curved saber lowered slightly, ready to lash out. Sunny glared at him for a moment, then cursed silently and threw an order over his shoulder, his tone calm and steady. "Kim, take Luster, climb onto my horse, and get the hell out of here. Get him help. The rest, retreat on foot. Saint will protect you." Luster, who had been staring at his missing legs with a confused expression, looked up at the sound of his voice and asked shakily what about him. "Captain?" Sunny grinned. "I'll keep our friend here company. Don't worry. I didn't survive Goliath and the heart of darkness to die to this little wretch today. Go." Kim was already dragging the young man toward Nightmare. her face pale and full of desperate determination. The scavenger spared them a glance, then stared back at Sunny, his mouth opened, and a hoarse, grating voice suddenly came out of it, telling the wretch he would die today. Then, an ugly, gasping sound assaulted Sunny's ears. The bastard was actually laughing. Sunny frowned. He couldn't care less if the abomination wished to mock him, but nevertheless. His heart suddenly turned cold. Nightmare creatures capable of speech were extremely rare, and all of them were extremely terrifying. He could attest to that fact himself. Sunny had already been uneasy, but now his caution doubled. The scavenger was dangerous. The little wretch had been abnormal from the very start. He was gaining power too fast, growing too explosively, of course. Antarctica was a perfect place for a creature like that to gorge on the corpses of powerful monsters. But still, Sunny's intuition was telling him that fighting the abomination alone would be a dire, dreadful mistake, but he had no better choice. He sighed with resignation. I guess my luck is just complete, utter crap today. All that remained was Sunny, the scavenger, and the shadows, Goliath, the heart of darkness, fighting his way back through the boundless nightmare creatures, and now this. Sunny was hurt, tired, and miserable, so much so, in fact, that he was getting a bit angry. Fine, let's do this, you rotten piece of trash. There was a perfectly fine nightmare creature here to vent his anger. Sunny had already failed to kill the scavenger twice. Today, fate generously gave him a chance to finish the job, and he wasn't going to let it slip from his hands. The scavenger was strangely unreasonable in his hate-fueled pursuit, following Sunny all the way from Low 49 across the hellscape of the Antarctic Center. Well, Sunny could be an unreasonable person himself. In fact, he was very tired of being reasonable all the time. Enough is enough. A dark, slightly mad light ignited in his eyes, behind him. Kim pushed Luster onto Nightmare's back, then jumped up herself. The black steed instantly shot forward, moving across the empty road with incredible speed. Belle, Dorn, and Samara followed, protected by Saint. All that remained was Sunny, the scavenger, and the shadows, and tons of explosives somewhere beneath their feet. The menacing black abomination moved, trying to dissipate into the shadows. But before it could, the shadows around it suddenly surged, shooting forward like sharp spikes. The spikes shattered against the creature's bone armor, but they did slow him down for a split second, and that was all that Sunny needed. Emerging from the darkness in front of the scavenger, he kicked him in the chest with a deafening boom. The creature was sent flying back, but managed to land on his feet. The black tusk whistled, tearing through the air, and collided against the white jade of the Sin of Solace. Sunny felt his hand tremble from the force of the blow, and smiled. Good, don't you die too easily. On the doomed streets of a snow-covered city, surrounded by ruins of collapsed buildings and remnants of devastating battles, a young man with alabaster skin and onyx hair was fighting a wraith made of darkness and hatred. One wore a simple tunic of beautiful black silk. The other was clad in menacing black armor. Both moved through the ruins like a pair of swift shadows. Sunny cursed and shouted for it to break. Sunny shuddered as he deflected a vicious strike of the mysterious black tusk, felt the impact send a painful jolt through his entire body, and guided the enemy's blade to the side. At the same time, he took a step forward and slammed his elbow into the scavenger's chest. The creature was pushed back, releasing the Sin of Solace from the bind. The cursed sword instantly flashed forward, slashing across the abomination's side. The defense, counterattack, and follow-up had been executed flawlessly, flowing into each other like the nimble steps of a graceful dance. Despite being light and swift, they also carried tremendous power and annihilating intent. And yet, the white jade slid fruitlessly off the black bone armor, barely leaving a scratch on it. What the hell are you made of, bastard? The scavenger was just too damn overbearing. At times, fighting him was fighting like water. When the Sin of Solace lashed out at the cracks in the bone armor, the scavenger would turn into a shadow, allowing the jade blade to harmlessly pass through. Other times, fighting him was like fighting against an indestructible mountain. The plates of black bone seemed utterly impervious, and the creature's blows carried with them crushing weight, even compared to the corrupted creatures Sunny had faced. The scavenger was abnormally powerful. He was so strong that it didn't even make sense. The sin of solace had come from the remnant of the Jade Queen, an astonishingly dreadful corrupted tyrant, and had an enchantment that bestowed it with unparalleled sharpness as well. What kind of indestructible creature had the vengeful goblin devoured to be able to resist its edge? It seemed as though there were peerless geniuses even among the nightmare creatures, and the pathetic, tiny imp Sunny had failed to kill many months ago just so happened to be one of those. Just my luck. Gritting his teeth, Sunny braced himself and received another blow of the black tusk. Another bloodless wound appeared on his body. None of them were deep enough to be dangerous, but the damage was slowly mounting. Worst of all, he was completely suppressed. There were countless ways for Sunny to kill the hateful fiend. For example, if the sharpness of the sin of solace itself wasn't enough, he could augment the power of the jade blade manifold with his shadows. He could manifest wild shadows. As well, forming chains, swords, or tentacles to attack and entangle the scavenger. He could use Shadow Step to keep up with the damned ogre. But he was prevented from doing any of these things. Sunny couldn't afford to augment his sword, because he needed the shadows to match the corrupted devil's speed and strength. And even then, the scavenger was faster and stronger. He couldn't wantonly use shadow manifestation, because his reserves of essence were nearly empty. The same went for Shadow Step, or any other trick he could come up with on the spot. The bastard had known just when to attack. He had only shown himself when Sunny was at his weakest. And now, Sunny was forced to defend himself against a nightmare creature of a superior rank while being robbed of most of his powers. Even those that remained were countered, because the scavenger possessed the same ones. Sunny couldn't really blame the abomination for setting such a wicked trap, though, because it had been precisely how he himself had slayed many powerful adversaries. Doesn't matter, I'll still kill you. You are going to die no matter what. Sunny's eye burned with cold fury as he released the hilt of the sin of solace, switching to a one-hand grip. The great giant was the same length as a longsword would have been, but incredibly light and swift, although it couldn't hack and slash with the same ferocious power as the scavenger's black blade. It was far more nimble and versatile. Sunny seamlessly switched to a more agile and reserved battle style, summoning the cruel sight into his free hand in the form of a short sword. The silver sword's ghost blade enchantment allowed it to strike down incorporeal targets, and so the scavenger was in for an unpleasant surprise the next time he chose to turn into a shadow. If there was one advantage Sunny had, it was his skill and experience. The scavenger was tremendously powerful, cunning, and possessed a truly vicious, murderous will. He had devoured a great number of mighty creatures and grown with explosive speed. The bastard was supremely devious and surprisingly intelligent, enough to survive and even thrive in the hellish meat grinder of the chain of nightmares, but he was still an abomination, and a young one at that. His attacks were smart and powerful, but also clumsy and crude, just like the makeshift saber he was using, which had obviously been fashioned from some dreadful monstrosity's tusk. For now, the scavenger was able to suppress Sunny simply because of his timing and vastly superior physical might. But he wasn't nearly as experienced of a killer. As for spite and viciousness, both had them in spades. Die. As soon as the cruel sight manifested itself, Sunny blocked the black tusk with the jade sword and then struck with the silver one, aiming at the elbow of the abomination's right arm. No matter how tough an armor was, it had to be weaker at the joints to allow for enough flexibility, and indeed, there was a gap between two bone plates there. In truth, Sunny wasn't sure if the cruel sight could cut even the weaker parts of the scavenger. However, the creature didn't know that. Just as expected, the vicious fiend chose not to risk it. The shadow powers he possessed were, strangely, both superior and inferior to Sunny's. As of yet, the abomination had only shown the ability to use a form of Shadow Step. That ability, however, was more insidious than the original, allowing the creature to not only teleport and turn incorporeal, but even selectively turn only parts of himself into shadow. And so, the body of the scavenger remained perfectly material, continuing to pressure Sunny with dreadful strength, while the middle of his right arm became ghostly and incorporeal. The cruel sight passed through the abomination's elbow without meeting any resistance, never even touching his flesh. However, The scavenger suddenly staggered and let out a pained hiss, causing a vicious grin to appear on Sunny's face. The silver blade might not have cut the creature's flesh, but it did cut his shadow, which was the same as cutting someone's soul. The damaged span of the fiend's arm instantly turned back to flesh and bone, but the damage was already done, using the momentary lapse in the scavenger's awareness. Sunny lunged forward and tangled with him, pushing them both to the ground. Fighting a slippery shadow was really a nightmare. He had far less essence to spare, giving the hateful fiend a vital advantage. Unlike Sunny, the scavenger could use Shadow Step as much as he wanted, avoiding attacks and launching his own from unexpected directions. The abomination could even escape if he wished. However, it wouldn't be able to do anything if Sunny was clutching it with his own two hands. As the two hit the ground, he growled and grasped the scavenger's throat, constricting it with enough force to shatter armored alloy. Sunny's eyes were shining with dark, malicious joy. If he couldn't break the bastard's armor, he would just strangle him. Most nightmare creatures still had to breathe, after all, even if the scavenger didn't. A broken neck was bound to solve something. It was strangely fitting. Actually, Sunny had killed his first abomination by strangling it with a chain, and now he was going to squeeze the life out of this corrupted devil, too. Die, die, die. Sunny kept trying to strangle the scavenger in a strange reversal of their previous encounter. His face was contorted into a bestial snarl, and his eyes were burning with indescribable bloodlust. The scavenger, however, wasn't easily killed at first. He seemed to have panicked and tried to throw Sunny off himself, but after realizing that getting rid of the small human was all but impossible, the abomination calmed down, stared at him with seething hatred, and tried to stab him in the back with the black tusk. The tip of the crude saber bit into the silk of the graceless dusk and failed to pierce it. Sunny laughed with savage joy. "Try harder, bastard." The scavenger obliged, dropping the tusk. He grabbed Sunny by the collar and, instead of trying to push him away, instead pulled him down. The two of them were suddenly face to face. Crap! The jagged line splitting the abomination's helmet opened, and countless sharp fangs instantly sank into Sunny's cheek. A scream tore from his throat, realizing that he was moments from having his face bitten off. Sunny let go of the fiend's neck and delivered a vicious punch into his solar plexus. Then he grabbed the creature's jaws, pushed them open by a few millimeters, and staggered back. The scavenger once again let out a hoarse, hateful laugh, his teeth painted by Sunny's blood. Sunny landed awkwardly on his backside and grabbed his cheek. The right side of his face was all torn, but at least he didn't lose an eye. Sadly, he already knew that the scavenger's teeth were poisoned. He yelled that the fiend was a horrid wretch, grabbing the sin of solace. Sunny lunged forward to strike down the fiend before he stood up. However, the creature simply turned into a shadow instead, trying to flee and then launch a surprise attack from a random direction. Sunny shouted that it wouldn't be that fast, without ever slowing down. Sunny dove into the shadows, too, in the dark realm of shadows. The shapeless form that was the scavenger was swiftly flying away, and the shapeless form that was Sunny pursued. All of the abandoned area was shrouded in darkness, so they could travel as far as they wanted. Unimpeded, the scavenger, as a shadow creature of the corrupted rank, here he was vast and dreadful, much more so than Sunny, and yet Sunny held an absolute advantage. He had fought as a shadow before a couple of times and was all but helpless each time. But Sunny had been a mere child of shadows then. Now he was their master. He had gained plenty of insight into shaping shadows thanks to shadow control, shadow manifestation, and especially his recent breakthrough, which he decided to name Shadow Shell. And since he was currently a shadow, too, closing in on the fleeing scavenger, Sunny willed his shapeless body to change. Instantly, it came to possess 4 long, powerful arms. Then, sharp claws grew out of his fingers, knowing that he didn't have a lot of essence left, and thus wouldn't be able to remain a shadow for long. Sunny didn't waste any time and tore into the formless abomination. Instantly, it was as though a soundless wail of pain spread through the dark space. The scavenger seemed both surprised and aggrieved by the fact that Sunny was able to hurt him in this realm, which he must have considered absolutely safe before. Frightened, he tried to fight back, launching powerful but awkward attacks of his own. A familiar, sickening pain of having his soul damaged permeated Sunny's senses. He had sustained some damage, too, but not nearly as much as the damned goblin, partially because the creature's blows were rudimentary and crude, and partially because his soul was protected by the marble shell. The scavenger realized that his struggles weren't having any effect, too. Escaping Sunny's cruel claws, he instantly escaped the shadows and emerged into the world above. They rolled through the ruins, exchanging a series of blows. Sunny received several more wounds, but the hateful fiend, his armor was still as impenetrable as ever. "Curse you! What do I've to do for you to finally die, damn it?" Infuriated, Sunny grabbed the towering ogre and smashed through the wall of a building. Using the creature's body as a ram, of course, that wasn't going to be of any use. A corrupted devil could crash through a mountain and still walk away without anything more than a couple bruises. Behind the wall, there was a slope of charred rubble. They fell down, ending up in a shallow pit. At some point, Sunny had lost his swords and the creature had lost its black saber. The two of them stared at each other for a moment, both full of murderous rage. Then, however, the scavenger's gaze changed slightly. Sunny's face changed, too. That was because he felt a slight tremor spreading through the ground beneath them. His eyes widened. Hell. The scavenger, despite all his sharp intelligence, was really too naive. The explosion wasn't going to harm a corrupted devil. However, the creature didn't know that. He had only gained full sentience a short few months ago, after all, in front of him. The battered fiend suddenly recoiled, trying to escape into the shadows once again. This time, he was going to simply blink away instead of traveling through the dark realm. But Sunny had other plans, he yelled, demanding to know where the wretch thought he was going. Grabbing the abomination by the shin, he dragged him back and then pressed the bastard into the ground. A series of painful blows rained on Sunny's already cut and injured body, but he just held the ogre tighter. "What? Are you afraid to die? Let's die together." The scavenger, despite all his sharp intelligence, was really too naive. The explosion wasn't going to harm a corrupted devil. However, the creature didn't know that. He had only gained full sentience a few short months ago. After all, Sunny laughed, then used all but a few drops of his remaining essence to call upon the shadows. They surged forth, encasing the two of them in a sphere. Then more shadows rose, creating a second layer around the black egg, and then the third. Sunny could have tried to escape the blast by turning incorporeal. However, there had to be a shadow for him to remain in that state. Once this whole area blew to smithereens, everything would be flooded with light, the shadows would be banished, and he would be thrown back into the material world. So, he created this egg, trapping the two of them inside. Maybe it was even sturdy enough to resist. "Wretch, one way or the other, you are going to die today." He continued to hold the scavenger and pummel him with his free hand, feeling the skin on his knuckles splitting despite being reinforced by the marble shell. The bone armor of the abomination, nevertheless, refused to crack. The scavenger fought back desperately. Too, they were surrounded by darkness, the world outside hidden by the walls of the black sphere. That was why Sunny didn't see the rampart protocol coming into effect to obliterate a vast swath of the city.